Hey now, we are live. We are going to be reading The Hobbit today. Welcome to another stream. I'm still in the setting up process here. I'm just setting up my my pinned message there. Okay. We're doing part 2 of The Hobbit reading, and I also have a special gift that I'm going to be opening today on stream. But first, we have to finish setting up, and I'm going to just see if I can get the word out here that I'm live. Oh, that's incorrect. Oh, that was the pinned message, not the go live message. Let me fix that. I can easily get that fixed. Okay, there we are. Somebody tag me in here. Hey Alice, how are you today? As a moderator, I'm sure you're aware that we're doing the PG rated stream today, but I'm sure you're also aware that that hasn't been an issue for any of the PG streams that we've done for the Tolkien channel. So I think we're going to have a rather smooth ride after the last reading stream and 2 episodes of the Council of Tolkien that all went very smoothly, I thought. Although the second episode of the Council of Tolkien, there was a lot of behind-the-scenes melodrama right before with all of the between the 3 of us, all of the technical issues. What song is in your head? Because, you know, for me, I've been walking around the house all day singing Yoshimi, and I'm sure that's annoying to everyone who's not me, but, you know. I just finish getting the word out here. Oh, that's right, and you did mention that you were on a bit of a kick of both the Beach Boys and the Beatles you mentioned. All right. I have Matt's gift here. Let me text Matt. I'd rather not do it on the phone, but I'll need the phone to unlock being able to do it on my computer. Because trying to type a link on a computer is, well, it's challenging. Copy text from photos. I don't care about that right now. Come over here. Let's see. How do I text someone on this? Oh, here we are. And there's Matt. I could just send a text without having to unlock my phone? Does that work? Let me see if it's sent. I'm going to look at my phone and see. I don't know if it syncs up properly, though. Wow, yeah, look at that. My go live message, I'm showing Matt's number here. It went through. Being able to text someone through the SMS on my computer without even having to unlock my phone is that's quite a good feature, I think. Weren't all their songs kind of a little bit on the short side? I don't seem to remember them having like very many long compositions. What is he talking about? Hey, Sarah. You ready for some of the Hobbitsals? I'm not going to do the see, when we get, because we're getting to Gollum now. We're going to be getting into that, because last time we did several chapters. Oh, hold on, the connection on my phone just reset. There we go. Hey, Moogle. We did An Unexpected Party. We did Roast Mutton. we did a short rest, and we did Overhill and Underhill. And so we're going to be starting with Riddles in the Dark, which is the Gollum chapter. It's actually the only chapter that Gollum's in. If you look at this book, this bit right here, this little bit right here, that's the only part that Gollum's in. And yet he had managed to become the most memorable part of the book for so many people. Understandable, Alice. We'll just talk about it some other time. Just really, you know, the most memorable part. And, yeah. Sorry, I'm just messaging Matt. So it's interesting that Gollum is actually much more of a character from The Lord of the Rings, but he made his debut in The Hobbit, and the one thing that I'm not going to do is, because it hurts my voice to do too much of it, I'm not going to do Gollum as Andy Serkis. You know, the hobbits. You know, I'm not going to do that, because it's fine to do it just a little bit, but to read the entire chapter, I don't have any Gollum juice. That's true. Yeah, Gollum juice is what was the recipe of it? Was like green tea, honey, and lemon. I think was Gollum juice, which sounds really delightful. I think it was green tea with lemon and honey. So I'm gonna do something more like this, right? Because that's actually more like the voice that Tolkien described. It's throaty. You know what I mean? Is there anything Andy Serkis can't do? Well, I gotta tell you. Teleport. Yet. He probably can't double jump, right? But he's such a talented voice actor, motion capture actor, straight up just actor, director, writer, and voiceover person. There's a difference between doing voice acting and doing voiceover work. Voice acting would be like his work with Gollum, his work with the Planet of the Apes, but no, I don't think I'll do Meatwad. I need it to be more intelligible than Meatwad. I'm gonna do it like this. But anyway, the reason I mention that is because, I don't know if you guys know this, but Andy Serkis did audiobook versions of The Lord of the Rings and The Silmarillion, which is really great. So, you know, that's just really cool. So the itinerary today will be starting pretty shortly. I'm going to open Matt's gift. We're going to recap the events of the first 4 chapters briefly, and then we'll get to the reading. And, of course, because it is an educational content stream, we're going to be doing an analysis, not just reading the whole story, because that would not be... you can't just go on Twitch and read a book like that, unless it's copyright free. It has to be transformative or educational. And we're striving for educational. You sent me a meme. Let's go take a look. I'm looking right now. That's accurate. That's accurate. That's great. There's a lot of memes of that sort of format where it shows the difference between elves in... There was one that I used not long ago, and there was somebody who got very, very upset with me on Quora because I had this. It was all 3 of the images were Squidward. And the first image was like elves in the Hobbit, and it was like just happy Squidward, right? And then the second one was elves in the Lord of the Rings, and it was the handsome Squidward face. And then the third one was elves in the Silmarillion, and it showed him like all traumatized looking, you know, in monochrome black and white with dark circles around his eyes and a 1,000-yard stare. And I used it to sort of illustrate the point of the elves being very, depicted extremely different in each of these works, mostly because, between the Silmarillion and the others, it's a very, very different time period and a different setting. But between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, it's also a different viewpoint. Viewing the elves through the lens of Bilbo is very different from viewing the elves through the lens of Frodo, or Sam, as the case may be. I was talking with Sid about this not long ago. One of my favorite quotes from The Lord of the Rings, from Sam, is, because Sam was very excited to go on this adventure, not just to be with Frodo and to do his duty in taking care of Frodo, but also because he wanted to see elves. He had heard so many stories of elves and how wonderful they are, especially from Bilbo, who pretty much educated him. And he finally meets the elves in the forest. They haven't even left the Shire at this point. They haven't gone through the Old Forest. They haven't met Tom Bombadil. They haven't been to Bree yet. They're still technically in the Shire. It's the very beginning portion. They haven't even picked up Merry. It's just Frodo and Sam and Pippin, and they meet some elves, and it's Gildor Inglorian and his company, and there's a lot of very interesting references to the Silmarillion in this scene. But anyway, they speak and to Gildor. I almost called him Finrod, and then Frodo says to Sam, You always wanted to see the elves. Now you've seen the elves. What do you think of them? And Sam becomes pensive for a moment. And he says, I get the feeling that it doesn't matter what I think of them. And then he said something like, they're almost too elf. They're too elvish. They're way more elf than I thought I was going to get, But and that's the thing, because they're so unchanging and so eternal in the eyes of a 28-year-old hobbit, meeting Finrod, Gildor. Gildor and Finrod were originally the same character. That's why I keep getting them confused. It's a whole complicated mess between Fingon and Finrod, and a character that was called Inglor, which became Gildor Inglorian, who was an early version of Finrod, Felagund, because Finrod became Fingon. It's a whole thing. I did hear that. I don't know how true it is, but I had heard that. But anyway, it's just like that, from that perspective of being a hobbit who's heard stories of elves and has never met them. It's like meeting a fairy, right? That's sort of the closest thing that I can say, like meeting something out of a storybook. And it's interesting that out of all the horrible encounters that Frodo has along the way, the first few are pleasant. He meets. He almost has an encounter with a Nazgul in Hobbiton, but he has these pleasant encounters with Bombadil and with Gildor and then Aragorn. Oh, okay, that's interesting to hear. But anyway, I think we're going to go ahead and open Matt's gift. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a backstory here. I'm actually going to come to the full screen thing. I have no idea what's in this, and I don't want to show my address, so I'm not going to hold it up too high. Not there. Here we are. Okay, so Matt is the leader of our little writers guild or writers consortium on Quora called the Nine. And the idea of the Nine is that we're like the 9 lore masters of Quora. He calls himself lore master on Quora. That's his account name. And we came together, and it's like the leaders, the 3 leaders are Matt and myself and Sid, and that's why we're the ones doing the Council of Tolkien. But anyway, we have a whole peer review group set up and everything. And yeah, so Matt had this idea. He asked each member of the 9 to name their favorite realm in Middle-earth. And he said that he was going to send us each a gift related to that realm. So it's difficult for me to look at Middle-earth and where is my favorite realm? And I always think of like the question of where would you live? If you lived in Middle-earth, where would you choose to live? And I had 2 choices, actually. My first choice was Lindon, which there's a subscriber. That scared the heck out of me. Lindon is a realm to the west of the Shire where the elves live, and that's actually at the end of The Lord of the Rings where you sail to the west, where Frodo and Bilbo and Gandalf and Galadriel and Elrond all sail to the west. And Shadowfax too, I think. That's a realm called Lindon, and that's my favorite. And then I said the second would be the Shire. And he said that there wasn't a gift for, like, the Shire wasn't available, or I'm sorry, Lindon wasn't available, so it had to go with the Shire. And I know that Sid chose Rivendell, and Matt himself had Mordor, and then there was other people who had chosen, Mirkwood and Gondor and Rohan and such. So I don't know what's in this. We're about to find out. I'm going to cut into it very carefully here because I really don't know what it is. I really don't want to hold it up too much because my address is on it in very large letters. So we're cutting into it. We're about to see what it is. I just know that it's related to the Shire. Okay. Alright. Let's take that out. Some kind of sack here. Let's put that aside. So we have some kind of sack. There's a wax seal on it. It says SP. I don't know if you can see that too well. But there's a wax seal, and I guess this is burlap or something. It says SP, and the S is like a dragon. And let's see if we can get this open and see what's in there. I don't know where this came from. Like if it came from like Etsy or something. There's papers and such. I don't know what this is. Okay, well here. Oh, okay. So that's. I think that's it right there. Let's see what else is in. It looks like there's several things in here. I'll show it all off in a moment. I believe that's a candle. And there's a little box here. SP is Shirepost. Shirepost.com. So we have some sort of and there's a letter here. There's a letter to here. It's addressed to me in runic writing. Look at that. Look at that. And there's a wax seal on this. Bit of hair in there as well. Oh, okay, so Matt told me, because he chose his realm as Mordor, and he told me that when you get this, you're going to know that it came from Mordor. And I don't know if you can see it too well, but the eye, oh, yeah, it's got some relief to it. It's the Eye of Sauron. It's the Eye of Sauron. Hey, Matt, that's you. I just opened it up. I'm getting it all opened up. So the wax seal on this is the Eye of Sauron. So I don't want to break that seal. I don't know what you mean by you're on, but hey, Matt. I don't want to break that seal. I want to preserve that, so I'm going to use the scissor to cut open the top of the envelope here. And we'll get it to what's inside without breaking the seal, because I want to preserve that. This is all going to wind up in my display case, I think. Alright, what do we have here? So, alright. Oh, okay. It's a letter. And a cart. Oh, there's another seal here, too. Can I preserve this one? Is it possible? Okay, I managed to preserve that. Well, let me read your note here, Matt, in the card part. It says, John, thank you for all your help and friendship on our secret project that many know about now. And your name, Matthew. Yeah, the secret project is we are working on a book. I mean, we did reveal that in the last stream that we did together. Thank you very much for that. Let me put that in a safe place there, and let's take a look at what this is. I didn't expect it to be many things. I thought it was going to be one thing. Okay. Okay, so this says... Greetings, esteemed lore masters. Enclosed is the seal of your realm for your use, I assume, in letters between us, and to seal your official approvals on documents in the old-fashioned way Tolkien would appreciate. Below is the best alphabet I found because it's easy and complete, except Q, X, and Z. It's Sindarin Kirith, Angurthas Daeron rune version, and there's a link. And I've provided it to you on the spire. The realms are as follows. So, yeah, see, I was the Shire, Geoffrey was New Dale, Dutch is Moria, Laurel chose Rohan, Sid was Rivendell, Nicolo chose Gondor, Eugene chose Harad, Mark chose Isengard, and Matt, of course, is Mordor. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit, 10 words that started it all, and I hope we keep it going by our letters in this format. And it says, Sincerely Matt, Obey Mordor, letter 1 of 11, June 2024. P.S. Signature format in UT, Appendix 25, 2040. Very nice, very nice. Okay, so let me put that in a safe place there. Now this appears to be, so this is a candle, but this is wax that you could use to create a seal. And then what I have here is the actual coin stamp that you use with it's marked with a willow tree that you use to create the wax seal, right? Can I open this while preserving this seal? Let's see. Yes, I can. Okay. Okay. All right, I've almost got the coin out. It's very well protected. Oh, it's... Here it is. Okay. So let's see if I can... Let me put the wax over here, the wax stick. And, yeah. I don't know how well that's going to show up. Oh, there. If I do it like that, it shows up. So it's the willow tree mark of the Shire. So if I want to send a letter with this, I would light this... I would light the wick, drip the wax onto the letter, and then hit it with this, and create a wax seal. That's very, 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 very cool, Matt. Thank you so much. There's actually one more thing, I think, included in this. This little box. This is curious. Let's see what this is. Oh, this is to stamp it down. It's a pestle. And it's got a magnet on it, I see that, yeah. So I can just, pick it up at that. Oh, that's a very strong magnet. That's a very strong magnet. It's on the wrong side. And then just splooch into the wax. And then I suppose the wax probably just washes off pretty easily. Okay. Let's go back over to the starting screen here because we're not ready to read yet. But thank you very much for that, Matt. And I hope you stick around and enjoy the reading. Because we're going to be starting with Riddles in the Dark. Isn't that cool? That was so cool. I'm going to have to find a way to make that work because it's such a lot of tiny little implements on my display case that I have back there. As you can see, I did add a few things. I'll use my my scissors as a pointer. That is the Bob's Burgers cookbook right there that EB got me. And over there is that Dragon Quest Akira Toriyama art book. And then, of course, you guys know about the records that Alice sent me. There's still more things to display on there. But we have it all pretty much displayed. But anyway, guys, let's start with reading The Hobbit. That's what we all came here for, right? So let's go over here, and let me go ahead and fade out the music here. So to recap the first 4 chapters that we read last time, we were introduced to our protagonist, Bilbo Baggins, Master of Bag End of the Shire. Of course, since it's The Hobbit and it's an earlier work, they don't mention the Shire. There's a lot of things that are not mentioned in this book. The Shire is not mentioned. Middle-earth is not mentioned. Eriador is not mentioned. Rovanion is not mentioned. There's a lot of alternate names for things, and some things are just not named at all. Here's a crazy one. The elf king of Mirkwood is only ever referred to in this book as the Elven King, or as simply just the King. It's not until The Lord of the Rings that we learn his name is Thranduil. But we are introduced to Bilbo Baggins, and he's just sort of a very normal sort of guy, at least on the surface. And then he meets Gandalf, the wizard, and the wizard... They have a very ridiculous conversation about the nature of the phrase good morning, and then Gandalf promises to send him on an adventure, which Bilbo's not all that interested with. The next day, a whole bunch of dwarves come up to his house, and they eat all his food, and they're led by Thorin Oakenshield, and they sort of cajole Bilbo into agreeing to this task of traveling to Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, which is in Rhovanion, very far away from the Shire, and somehow disposing of the dragon Smaug, and then returning with the treasure. And what has happened so far is Bilbo came afoul of some trolls and managed to get out of that one alive with the help of Gandalf. The trolls were all turned to stone by the sun, and they found some very magnificent weapons in the troll horde. And then they had a short rest at Rivendell, where they met Elrond, who told them what those weapons were, that they were from an elven land far to the west that is now gone, which was called Gondolin, and that Thorin's sword, Orcrist, which means goblin cleaver, was actually the king's sword, and then its mate was Gandalf's sword, Glamdring, and Bilbo also has a little dagger that he uses as a sword. And then they left Rivendell, and they attempted to pass the Misty Mountains, and there were giants throwing boulders around for fun. And then what happened was they got captured by some orcs. Gandalf saved them. He killed the great goblin, and they ran off, but then they dropped Bilbo, and he hit his head, and he lost consciousness. And that's where we left off. So here we go, and we'll be pausing every now and then to talk about what we read, to go over it, to analyze it, to take questions, or whatever we have here. So let's start with Chapter 5, Riddles in the Dark. When Bilbo opened his eyes, he wondered if he had, for it was just as dark as with them shut. No one was anywhere near him. Just imagine his fright. He could hear nothing, see nothing, and he could feel nothing except the stone of the floor. Very slowly he got up and groped about on all fours, till he touched the wall of the tunnel, but neither up nor down could he find anything, nothing at all, no sign of goblins, no sign of dwarves. His head was swimming, and he was far from certain even of the direction they had been going in when he had had his fall. He guessed as well as he could, and crawled along for a good way, till suddenly his hand met with what felt like a tiny ring of cold metal lying on the floor of the tunnel. It was a turning point in his career, but he did not know it. He put the ring in his pocket almost without thinking. Certainly it did not seem of any particular use at the moment. He did not go much further, but sat down on the cold floor and gave himself up to complete miserableness for a long while. He thought of himself frying bacon and eggs in his own kitchen at home, for he could feel inside that it was high time for some meal or other. But that only made him miserabler. So I'm going to pause right here and just to sort of praise Tolkien for daring to use the word miserabler. A lesser writer would have said that's too awkward, let's go with more miserable. And Tolkien's like, if it's in the dictionary, it's fair game. Also to mention, he's obviously found the One Ring. At this point, he does not know it is the One Ring. He doesn't even know that it has any magic. He hasn't even really seen it. He's crawling around in complete darkness. He can't see anything. And he found something and put it in his pocket. All right, so let's continue. He could not think what to do, nor could he think of what had happened, or why he had been left behind, or why, if he had been left behind, the goblins had not caught him, or even why his head was so sore. The truth was he had been lying quiet, out of sight and out of mind, in a very dark corner for a long while. After some time he felt for his pipe. It was not broken, and that was something. Then he felt for his pouch, and there was some tobacco in it, and that was something more. Then he felt for matches, and he could not find any at all, and that shattered his hopes completely. Just as well for him, as he agreed when he came to his senses. Goodness knows what the striking of matches and the smell of tobacco would have brought on him out of dark holes in that horrible place. Still, at the moment he felt very crushed, but in slapping all his pockets and feeling all around himself for matches, his hand came on the hilt of his little sword, the little dagger that he had gotten from the trolls, and that he had quite forgotten. Nor, fortunately, had the goblins noticed it, as he wore it inside his breeches. So he drew it out. It shone pale and dim before his eyes. So it is an elvish blade, too, he thought, and goblins are not very near, and yet not far enough. But somehow he was comforted. It was rather splendid to be wearing a blade made in Gondolin for the goblin wars of which so many songs had been sung, and also he had noticed that such weapons made a great impression on goblins that came upon them suddenly. Go back, he thought? No good at all. Go sideways? Impossible. Go forward? Only thing to do. On we go. So up he got, and he trotted along with his little sword held in front of him, and one hand feeling the wall, and his heart all a pitter and a patter. Hey, Chocolate, how's it going? So just pause there and to comment on this. So we get a little bit more of a confirmation that the blades of Gondolin glow in the presence of orcs, or goblins as they're called in this book. It's a little bit not so clear in the previous chapter, because it seemed almost that Gandalf's blade had fed off of killing the goblins and then started to glow. But now we can see not only do these blades glow in the presence of goblins, but that it's almost like a proximity. The closer the goblins are, the brighter the glow. So Bilbo is seeing that it's a very pale glow, so they're close, but they're not super, super close. The other thing I wanted to draw attention to here is the usage of the word tobacco. In The Lord of the Rings, it's never referred to as tobacco. It's always referred to as pipeweed or Westman's weed. The Westman's weed was brought to Middle-earth from Numenor. That's why it's called Westman's weed. Numenor is literally land of the West, the land of gift, or Atalanta, or Avalone, or Atlantis. And Chocolata, thank you for the watch streak. So what's interesting is that everybody was calling it Westman's weed, and it was brought to Middle-earth, which represents Europe in this case, by men of Numenor, the Dunedain. And they didn't smoke it, actually. They just appreciated it because it smelled nice. It had a very sweet smell. They were using it as sort of like a potpourri, or just as a bouquet of leaves and weed that they would use to just create a nice smell. And it was the hobbits who actually figured out to smoke it. Now, Tolkien put in a lot of references in The Hobbit to things that were a bit anachronistic for the setting, such as tomatoes, potatoes, and tobacco. And in his revision, he took out the reference to tomato, but he felt that potatoes, even though they come from South America and they wouldn't be in Middle-earth, they're too important to the culture to not have them there. And it could easily be explained that they may have come from Aemon, or they may have come from Middle-earth, or whatever. Not Middle-earth, or from Numenor. And tobacco is easily explained as coming, but he doesn't use the word tobacco in his later works. He always says pipeweed. And it's true. He doesn't over-explain the mechanics of any of his magic, actually. His magic is always just sort of, it is what it is. And when characters are asked to explain it, especially the elves, they're just sort of like, we don't know. So we're going to continue here. Now, certainly Bilbo was in what is called a tight place, but you must remember that it was not quite so tight for him as it would have been for me or for you. Hobbits are not quite like ordinary people. And after all, their holes are nice cheery places and properly aired, quite different from the tunnels of the goblins. Still, they are more used to tunneling than we are, and they do not easily lose their sense of direction underground, not when their heads have recovered from being bumped. Also, they can move very quietly and hide easily and recover wonderfully from falls and bruises, and they have a fund of wisdom and wise sayings that men have mostly never heard or forgotten long ago. I should not have liked to have been in Mr. Baggins's place all the same. The tunnel seemed to have no end. All he knew was that it was still going down pretty steadily and keeping the same direction in spite of a twist or a turn or two. There were passages leading off to the side every now and then, as he knew by the glimmer of his sword, or he could feel with his hand on the wall. Of these he took no notice except to hurry past for fear of goblins or half-imagined dark things coming out of them. On he went, and down, until he had heard no sound of anything except the occasional whir of a bat by his ears, which startled him at first till it became too frequent to bother about. I do not know how long he kept on like this, hating to go on, not daring to stop, on, until he was tireder than tired. It seemed like all the way to tomorrow and over it into the days beyond. Suddenly, without any warning, he trotted splash into water. Ugh, it was icy cold. That pulled him up sharp and short. He did not know whether it was just a pool in the path or the edge of an underground stream that crossed the passage or the brink of a deep, dark subterranean lake. The sword was hardly shining at all. He stopped, and he could hear, when he listened hard, drops drip, drip, dripping from an unseen roof into the water below, but there seemed no other sort of sound. So it is a pool or a lake and not an underground river, he thought. Still, he did not dare to wade out into the darkness. He could not swim, and he thought, too, of nasty, slimy things with big, bulging, blind eyes wriggling in the water. There are strange things living in the pools and lakes in the hearts of mountains. Fish whose fathers swam in goodness only knows how many years ago, never swam out again, while their eyes grew bigger and bigger and bigger from trying to see in the blackness. Also, there are other things more slimy than fish. Even in the tunnels and caves the goblins have made for themselves, there are other things living unbeknownst to them that have sneaked in from outside to lie up in the dark. Some of these caves, too, go back to their beginnings, to ages before the goblins, who only widen them and join them up with passages, and the original owners are still there in the odd corners, slinking and nosing about. All right, let's talk about this. This is a lot right here. There's a lot to unpack. First of all, he talks about... First of all, I just want to talk about the narrative voice, and I talked about this in the last Council of Tolkien stream. It was my preferred topic that day. That there's sort of an editorializing feel to this, where the narrator says, I should not have liked to have been in Mr. Baggins's place. But we are to understand that in universe that Bilbo did write this. So it's interesting that Bilbo would write his story not only from the third person, but comment as if from the standpoint of someone who is not a hobbit. And in the original sort of idea of the Legendarium, that these were all chronicles of the past brought to England from the Undying Lands by an elf named Elfwine, we could say that this is Tolkien's editorializing then, in that case. Which it is, but even in universe, it is Tolkien's editorializing, because it was brought from the Undying Lands to Oxford, and then translated by J.R.R. Tolkien. So yeah, there's layers upon layers. Another thing is he talks about things from before the goblins, and Gandalf mentions this in the sequel in The Lord of the Rings. He says that there are nameless things that gnaw at the roots of the earth, and by understanding what he means by gnawing at the roots of the earth, it means tunneling, creating tunnels, and that these goblins came in and they widened them and used them, but they were already there. That they're gnawing at the root of Arda, the root of the planet. and they don't have names because they've never been seen. In The Lord of the Rings, there's a giant squid in the lake outside of Moria that might have been one of these sort of things, but you don't usually think of a squid burrowing through rock like that. So that could have been one of the types of things that's down there. We really don't know. It was suggested in the Silmarillion that they were more like spiders. And that Ungoliant, who was sort of a demon in a sense, mated with the things that came out of the earth that had also taken the form of spiders as she had. And that created the giant spiders such as Shelob and her brood in Mirkwood Forest, which Bilbo is going to run into in a later chapter. Okay. All right, let's move on. Deep down here in the dark water lived old Gollum, a small slimy creature. I don't know where he came from, nor who or what he was. He was Gollum, as dark as darkness, except for two big, round, pale eyes in his thin face. He had a little boat, and he rowed about quite quietly on the lake, for lake it was, wide and deep and deadly cold. He paddled it with his large feet dangling over the side, but never a ripple did he make, not he. He was looking out of his pale lamp-like eyes for blind fish, which he grabbed with his long fingers as quick as thinking. He liked meat, too. Goblin he thought good when he could get it, but he took care that they never found him out. He just throttled them from behind, if they ever came down alone, anywhere near the edge of the water, while he was prowling about. They very seldom did, for they had a feeling that something unpleasant was lurking down there, down at the very roots of the mountain. They had come on the lake when they were tunneling down long ago, and they found they could go no further. So there their road ended in that direction, and there was no reason to go that way, unless the great goblin sent them. Sometimes he took a fancy for fish from the lake, and sometimes neither goblin nor fish came back. Actually, Gollum lived on a slimy island of rock in the middle of the lake. He was watching Bilbo now from the distance with his pale eyes like telescopes. Bilbo could not see him, but he was wondering a lot about Bilbo, for he could see that he was no goblin at all. Okay, to pause here and to speak of what we've... I know I'm pausing a lot more than last time, but there's a lot to unpack here. The biggest thing here... Well, there's sort of two things. One is, what is Gollum's complexion? A lot of us think of him as this pale creature that was seen in the films, and there are passages in The Lord of the Rings that suggest that he was indeed very, very pale. And there are passages in The Lord of the Rings and right here that suggest he's very, very dark, that he's dark as darkness. And it's sort of like hard to nail down. It's inconsistent. So, as being a Tolkien scholar and trying to unravel this mystery, was Gollum dark-skinned or was he light-skinned? I would have to say that he was certainly light-skinned, and that the references to him being dark are because he has dark hair, because he is wearing dark clothing, and because he is actually very dirty, which makes perfect sense. The other thing that I wanted to mention was... well, it's interesting that he has a boat. That's not it. It's interesting, though, that he has a boat. But there was something else, and it's sort of flown out of my head here, which is a shame. There was something specifically about Gollum that I wanted to point out here. Actually, it's more about J.R.R. So Tolkien was Jinx indeed. Tolkien was a Catholic. And you actually, you see bits and pieces of it come out in his work, most particularly in the Silmarillion, but a little bit in the Lord of the Rings, and a little bit here in the Hobbit too. And the biggest thing that is indicating that he's a Catholic here is stating that Gollum eats fish from the lake. And then it states that he also likes meat. And it's sort of a very Catholic idea that fish is not meat. And we think about it, how can that be? Fish is meat. It's the meat of a fish. But in Catholicism, in their dogma, it is considered not meat for whatever reason. And what we get there from the understanding, it's like in Lent, you're not supposed to eat meat on a Friday. So many Catholics turn to eating fish on Fridays, which is sort of, to me, it seems like cheating, right? Oh, that doesn't count because it's fish. Like you could just have pasta or something for one day, but it seems like it's cheating, but it has become sort of a very European and to a lesser extent American tradition of Catholics eating meat on Fridays, and because they don't consider it to actually be meat. And sometimes it's an all year round thing, sometimes it's just during Lent, but yeah, beaver is considered fish in Catholicism for some reason. I remember reading about that once. That is very true. Beavers never come up in Tolkien's work. They're never mentioned. I wonder if there are beavers in Middle-earth. There might be, right? There might be. They might be damming up some rivers right now. Okay, let's continue. I'll try to pause less here, but I had to mention that about a little bit of Tolkien's Catholic upbringing coming out in the idea that fish is not meat. Gollum got into his boat and shot off from the island, while Bilbo was sitting on the brink, altogether flummoxed, and at the end of his way in his wits. Suddenly, up came Gollum and whispered and hissed, "Bless us and splash us, my precious. I guess it's a choice feast, at least a tasty morsel that'd make us, Gollum." And when he said Gollum, he made a horrible swallowing noise in his throat. That is how he got his name, though he always called himself my precious. It's a speedboat, indeed. The Hobbit jumped nearly out of his skin when the hiss came into his ears, and he suddenly saw the pale eye sticking out at him. "Who are you?" he said, thrusting his dagger in front of him. "What is he, my precious?" whispered Gollum, who always spoke to himself, though never having anyone else to speak to. This is what he had come to find out, for he was not really very hungry at the moment, only curious. Otherwise he would have grabbed first and whispered afterwards. "Hi, Mr. Bilbo Baggins. I've lost the dwarves and I've lost the wizard, and I don't know where I am, and I don't want to know. If only I can get away." "What's he got in his hands?" said Gollum, looking at the sword, which he did not quite like. "A sword, a blade that came out of Gondolin," said Gollum, and became quite polite. "Perhaps he sits here and chats with us a bitsy, my precious. It like riddles, perhaps it does it?" He was anxious to appear friendly, at any rate for the moment, and until he found out more about the sword and the hobbit, whether he was quite alone really, whether he was good to eat, and whether Gollum was really hungry. Riddles were all he could think of. Asking them, and sometimes guessing them, had been the only game he had ever played with other funny creatures sitting in their holes in the long, long ago. Before he lost all his friends, he was driven away alone and crept down into the dark under the mountains. All right, I promise I'll get through the riddle game without commenting, but I want to comment here. Even though Gollum was not conceived in the writing at this point to be a hobbit, there's a line here about him living in a hole like a hobbit, and that he lost all his friends, and we know the story from the Lord of the Rings of what happened to him, that his real name being Smeagol and all this, but it's interesting. I don't have a first edition copy, or a reproduction of a first edition copy. This is the chapter that was altered heavily in the revised edition to make Gollum's personality more like in the Lord of the Rings, and I should track down a reproduction of the first edition, or perhaps a digital version of the first edition, and see whether or not it's mentioned that he lived in a hole. Anyway, let's continue. "Very well," said Bilbo, who was anxious to agree until he found out more about the creature, whether he was quite alone, whether he was fierce or hungry, and whether he was friend of the goblins. "You ask first," he said, because he had not had time to think of a riddle. So Gollum hissed, "What has roots as nobody sees, is taller than trees, up it goes, and yet never grows?" "Easy," said Bilbo. "A mountain, I suppose." "Does it guess easy? It must have a competition with us, my precious. If Precious asks, and it doesn't answer, we eats it, my precious. If it asks us and we don't answer, then we does what it wants, eh? We shows it the way out, yes." "All right," said Bilbo, not daring to disagree, and nearly bursting his brain to think of riddles that could save him from being eaten. 30 white horses on a red hill. First they champ, then they stamp, then they stand still." That was all he could think of to ask. The idea of eating was rather on his mind. It was rather an old one, too, and Gollum knew the answer as well as you do.
Chestnuts, he hissed. Teeth, my precious. But we only have 6.
Then he asked his second.
Voiceless it cries, ringless flutters, toothless bits, mouthless mutters.
Half a moment, cried Bilbo, who was still thinking uncomfortably about eating. Fortunately, he had once heard something rather like this before, and getting his wits back, he thought of the answer. Wind, of course, he said, and he was so pleased that he made up one on the spot. This'll puddle the nasty little underground creature, he thought. An eye in a blue flame saw an eye in a green face. That eye is like to this eye, said the first eye, but in low place, not in high place. Said Gollum. He had been underground a long time, and was forgetting this sort of thing. But just as Bilbo was beginning to hope that the wretch would not be able to answer, Gollum brought up memories of ages and ages and ages before, when he lived with his grandmother in a hole in a bank by a river.
My precious, he said. Sun on the daisies, it means it does.
But these ordinary above-ground, everyday sort of riddles were tiring for him. Also, they reminded him of old days when he had been less lonely and sneaky and nasty, and that put him out of temper. What is more, they made him hungry, so this time he tried something a bit more difficult and more unpleasant.
It cannot be seen, cannot be felt, cannot be heard, cannot be smelt. It lies behind stars and under hills, and empty holes it fills. It comes first and follows after, ends life, kills laughter.
Unfortunately for Gollum, Bilbo had heard that sort of thing before, and the answer was all around him anyway. Dark, he said, without even scratching his head or putting on his thinking cap. A box without hinges, key, or lid, yet golden treasure inside is hid. He asked to gain time, until he could think of a really hard one. This he thought a dreadfully easy chestnut, though he had not asked it in the usual words. But it proved a nasty poser for Gollum. He hissed to himself, and still he did not answer. He whispered and spluttered. After some while, Bilbo became impatient. Well, what is it? He said. The answer's not a kettle boiling over, as you seem to think from the noise you're making.
Give us a chance. Let it give us a chance, my precious.
Well, said Bilbo, after giving him a long chance, what about your guess? But suddenly Gollum remembered thieving from nests long ago, and sitting under the river bank, teaching his grandmother to suck.
Eggs, he hissed. Eggs it is.
Then he asked,
alive without breath, as cold as death, never thirsty, ever drinking, all in mail, never clinking.
He also thought in his turn this was a dreadfully easy one, because he was always thinking of the answer. But he could not remember anything better at the moment, he was so flustered by the egg question. All the same, it was a poser for poor Bilbo, who never had anything to do with the water if he could help it. I imagine you know the answer, of course, or can guess it as easy as winking, since you're sitting comfortably at home and have not the danger of being eaten to disturb your thinking. Bilbo sat and cleared his throat once or twice, but no answer came. After a while, Gollum began to hiss with pleasure to himself.
Is it nice, my precious? Is it juicy? Is it scrumptiously crunchable?
He began to peer at Bilbo out of the darkness. Half a moment, said the hobbit, shivering. I gave you a good long chance just now.
It must make haste,
said Gollum, beginning to climb out of his boat onto the shore to get at Bilbo. But just when he put his long, webby foot in the water, a fish jumped out of fright and fell in Bilbo's toes. Ugh, he said, so cold and clammy. And so he guessed. Fish, fish, he cried. It is fish. Gollum was dreadfully disappointed, but Bilbo asked another riddle as quick as he ever could, so that Gollum had to get back into his boat and think. No legs lay on one leg, 2 legs sat near 3 legs, 4 legs got some. It was not really the right time for this riddle, but Bilbo was in a hurry. Gollum might have had some trouble guessing it if he had asked it at another time. As it was, thinking of fish, no legs was not very difficult, and after that the rest was easy.
Fish on a little table, man at table sitting on a stool, the cat has the bones.
That, of course, is the answer, and Gollum soon gave it. Then he thought the time had come to ask something hard and horrible. This is what he said.
This thing all things devour, Birds, beasts, trees, flowers. Gnaws iron, bites steel, grinds hard stones to meal, slays king, ruins town, and beats high mountains down.
Poor Bilbo sat in the dark thinking of all the horrible names of all the giants and ogres he had ever heard of in tales. But not one of them had done all these things. He had a feeling that the answer was quite different and that he ought to know it, but he could not think of it. He began to get frightened, and that is bad for thinking. Gollum began to get out of his boat. He flapped into the water and paddled to the bank. Bilbo could see his eyes coming up towards him. His tongue seemed to stick in his mouth. He wanted to shout out, "Give me more time! Give me time!" But then all that came out with a sudden squeal was, "Time! Time!" Bilbo was saved by pure luck, for that, of course, was the answer. Gollum was disappointed once more, and now he was getting angry and also tired of the game. It had made him very hungry indeed. This time he did not go back into the boat. He sat down in the dark by Bilbo. That made the hobbit most dreadfully uncomfortable and scattered his wits.
"It's got to ask us a question, my precious. Yes, yes, yes. Just one question to guess. Yes, yes,"
said Gollum. But Bilbo simply could not think of any question with that nasty, wet, cold thing sitting next to him and pawing at him and poking him. He scratched himself. He pinched himself. Still he could not think of anything.
Ask us, said Gollum.
Bilbo pinched himself and slapped himself. He gripped on his little sword. He even felt in his pocket with his other hand. Then he found the ring that he had picked up in the passage and forgotten about. "What have I got in my pocket?" he said out loud. He was talking to himself, but Gollum thought it was a riddle. And he was frightfully upset.
Not fair, he hissed. "It isn't fair, my precious, is it, to ask us what it's got in its nasty little pockets?"
Bilbo, seeing what had happened, and having nothing better to ask, stuck to his question. "What have I got in my pocket?" he said louder. Hissed Gollum.
"It must give us 3 guesses, my precious, 3 guesses."
"Very well, guess away," said Bilbo.
"Hanses,"
said Gollum. "Wrong," said Bilbo, who had luckily just taken his hand out again. "Guess again," said Gollum, more upset than ever. He thought of all the things he kept in his own pockets. Fish bones, goblins' teeth, wet shells, a bit of bat wing, and a sharp stone to sharpen his fangs on, and other nasty things. He tried to think of what other people kept in their pocket. "Knife," he said at last. "Wrong," said Bilbo, who had lost his some time ago. "Last guess." Now Gollum was in much worse state than when Bilbo would ask him the egg question. He hissed and spluttered and rocked himself backward and forward and slapped his feet on the floor and wriggled and squirmed, but still he did not dare to waste his last guess. "Come on," said Bilbo, "I am waiting." He tried to sound bold and cheerful, but he did not feel at all sure how the game was going to end, whether Gollum guessed right or not. "Time's up," he said.
"String or nothing,"
shrieked Gollum, which was not quite fair, working in 2 guesses at once. "Both wrong," cried Bilbo, very much relieved. And he jumped at once to his feet, put his back to the nearest wall, and held out his little sword. He knew, of course, that the riddle game was sacred and of immense antiquity, and even wicked creatures were afraid to cheat when they played at it. But he felt he could not trust this slimy thing to keep any promise at a pinch. Any excuse would do for him to slide out of it. And after all, that last question had not been a genuine riddle, according to the ancient laws. Okay, so yeah, the note, I was going to mention that. We're going to pause here. The note that he sharpens his teeth with a rock, and also that he only has 6 teeth is very interesting. To comment specifically on these riddles, they're all very interesting. When I read this as a child, I was in the 3rd grade when I first read this book. It was interesting because it would say these riddles, and then it would say, "But of course you know the answer." And I'm like, "No, I don't," No, not quite. What's interesting here is how much we learn about the characters in the world, specifically from the riddles themselves. The first riddle, the answer was a mountain, and that, of course, is Bilbo's goal, to get to Erebor, the lonely mountain. He is trying to get into a mountain, and he's under a mountain. Then the tooth joke, the tooth riddle, we learn that Gollum only has 6 teeth. And then we have the wind. Now, that one's not very, very significant. But then we get on to Sun on the Daisies, and through that we learn a little bit about Gollum. He used to live with his grandmother, and then we get to the egg one, and he taught his grandmother to suck eggs, which is sort of an aphorism teaching your grandmother to suck eggs is really sort of the old-fashioned way of saying something akin to mansplaining. Explaining something to someone who already knows the explanation. The idea that, like, you could teach your grandmother to suck eggs is patently ridiculous because she's older than you. She's from 2 generations back. She knows how to suck eggs. And usually we don't teach our grandparents things. But Gollum is sort of an interesting sort. He would be the sort of person who would try to teach his grandmother to suck eggs. And it's very elaborated on in The Lord of the Rings that he was close to his grandmother, and elaborated further in the letters of Tolkien that she was the only one that he was really close to other than Deagle. And then we get to the fish. Of course, Gollum's very associated with fish. And then we have time, because time is running out. And you notice that Gollum's riddles are a lot darker. Bilbo's are mostly about food. And his are about, well, he has one that's teeth. It's about eating. But it's all darkness and time and death and such like that. And then, of course, what have I got in my pocket, which was not meant to be a riddle. Now, it's mentioned that even wicked creatures would not cheat. But they're also saying that Gollum would. So he's worse than evil. And there was a reference earlier to the fact that the goblins were afraid of him. That they thought of him as something nasty lurking there. And imagine being an orc, living under the mountain, and then thinking, there's something nasty down here. And that really, really nails how nasty Gollum actually is. A lot of people who saw the film version of The Lord of the Rings and the film version of The Hobbit, they think of him as almost being sort of cute. And they think of him in this way, and then when you read this, and he's something that even the goblins thought was nasty, and that he's more evil than evil, really, in a much more base sort of way. And then in The Lord of the Rings, we learned that he eats babies, and that he actually seems to prefer to consume the young. He makes several references to consuming the young. And Gandalf says that he eats babies. And here we get that he robbed nests to get his eggs. And in The Lord of the Rings, there is a line about him creeping into nests and creeping into cradles to steal the young to devour. When he brings rabbits to Sam, he mentions that they are nice and young. He seems to he doesn't only attack the young because they're weak and because they're easy prey, but because he prefers it. There's something about him consuming youth that, to me at least, ties into the riddles here of time and death and misery that is his existence. And when you've been living with essentially a piece of Sauron's power for 500 years, I can understand that he's gotten quite dark. All right, let's continue here. But at any rate, Gollum did not at once attack him. He could see the sword in Bilbo's hand. He sat still, shivering and whispering. At last Bilbo could wait no longer. "Well," he said, "what about your promise? I want to go. You must show me the way."
"Did we say so, precious? Show the nasty little baggins the way out, yes. But what has it got in its pockets, Not string, precious, but not nothing. Oh, no."
"Never you mind," said Bilbo. "A promise is a promise."
"Cross it is, impatient, precious," hissed Gollum. "But it must wait, yes, it must. We can't go up the tunnels so hasty. We must go and get some things first. Yes, things to help us."
"Well, hurry up," said Bilbo, relieved to think that Gollum going away. He thought he was just making an excuse, and did not mean to come back. What was Gollum talking about? What useful thing could he keep out in the dark lake? But he was wrong. Gollum did mean to come back. He was angry now and hungry, and he was a miserable, wicked creature, and already he had a plan. Not far away was his island, of which Bilbo knew nothing, and there in his hiding place he kept a few wretched oddments and one very beautiful thing. Very beautiful, very wonderful. He had a ring, a golden ring, a precious ring.
My birthday present,
he whispered to himself, as he had often done in the endless dark days.
That's what we want now. Yes, we want it.
He wanted it because it was a ring of power. And if you slipped that ring on your finger, you were invisible. Only in the full sunlight could you be seen, and then only by your shadow, and that would be shaky and faint.
My birthday present. It came to me on my birthday, my precious.
So he'd always said to himself. But who knows how Gollum came by that present ages ago in the old days when such rings were still at large in the world. Perhaps even the master who ruled them could not have said. Gollum used to wear it at first, till it tired him, and then he kept it in a pouch next to his skin, till it galled him, and now usually he hid it in a hole in the rock on his island, and was always going back to look at it, and still sometimes he put it on when he could not bear to be parted it from it any longer, or when he was very, very hungry and tired of fish. Then he would creep along dark passages looking for stray goblins. He might even venture into places where the torches were lit and made his eyes blink and smart, for he would be safe. Oh yes, quite safe. No one would see him, no one would notice him till he had his fingers on their throat. Only a few hours ago he had worn it, and caught a small goblin imp. How it squeaked! He still had a bone or two left to gnaw, but he wanted something softer. Absolutely have to talk about this. Absolutely have to talk about this. So the birthday present thing, I mean, we know he did get it on his birthday, and that was a whole thing. I'm not going to get into that too much. Notice that Tolkien specifically calls it a ring of power, but in the text, ring and power are not capitalized. So this is before the idea of the rings of power. And I don't know if it's part of the revision or not, but I can say that it's interesting that he calls it that and then makes reference to the master. And that is capitalized. Capital M for master. Gray, watch it, please. PG today. The master with a capital M. The master who ruled them. This is the first reference we have to the Lord of the Rings. And this is 20 years before. I mean, it's 20 years before he wrote it, but this is the revision 10 years after. I don't know if that, like I said, I have to get myself a first edition facsimile or a digital copy or something, so I could review the original version more carefully. But yeah, it's interesting that we basically get a reference to the master with a capital M referring to Sauron. Also, going back to the idea of Gollum eating the young, it is mentioned that it wasn't too long ago that he ate a goblin imp and that it squeaked. It's a young goblin. He prefers them. All right, let's continue.
Quite safe, yes, he whispered to himself. It won't see us, will it, my precious? No, it won't see us, and its nasty little sword will be useless, yes, quite.
That is what was in his wicked little mind as he slipped suddenly from Bilbo's side and flapped back to his boat and went off into the dark. Bilbo thought he had heard the last of him. Still he waited a while, for he had no idea how to find his way out alone. Suddenly he heard a screech. It sent a shiver down his back. Gollum was cursing and wailing away in the gloom, not very far off from the sound of it. He was on his island, scrabbling here and there, searching and seeking in vain.
Where is it? Where is it?
Bilbo heard him crying.
Lost it, my precious, lost, lost, curse us and crush us, my precious is lost.
What is the matter? Bilbo called. What have you lost?
It mustn't ask us, shrieked Gollum. Not its business, no, Gollum. It's lost. Gollum, Gollum, Gollum.
Well, so am I, cried Bilbo, and I want to get unlost, and I won the game and you promised, so come along. Come and let me out, and then go on with your looking. Utterly miserable as Gollum sounded, Bilbo could not find much pity in his heart, and he had a feeling that anything Gollum wanted so much could hardly be something good. Have to stop here. Have to talk about this. We have to talk about it. First of all, anything that Gollum wanted couldn't be something good. There it is right there. The ring is evil. This is before we know that it's the Necromancer's ring, before the word Sauron has ever been uttered, before we know of its past, before we know that it is in fact the One Ring, we know that it's evil. Anything Gollum wants is not something good. Another thing that we absolutely have to come to here is, let's see, what was it? The idea of him killing the goblin, and I should have mentioned this before, was probably when he lost the ring. And in the film version of The Hobbit, they had it like that, where it actually showed Gollum strangling a small goblin and then losing the ring and then Bilbo finding it. That's not part of the book, but it is probably lore accurate in the sense that that was his last hunting excursion when he would have used the ring. Now, the nature of the ring comes out a little bit. He kept it on at all times until it tired him. Think of Frodo in Mordor with the ring, or Isildur finding pain from touching the ring, or even Sam feeling the weight of it. Bilbo saying that he felt like too much butter spread over too little bread after having the ring for so long. It tires you. And then he kept it with him, and it galled him. The ring is actually trying to distance itself from Gollum. Sauron is where it wants to be. That it is part of Sauron. It's part of his power. It's most of his power, I would say. And then Isildur had it. And Isildur was the one person who had the ring and actually tried to master it, to use its power. And the ring fought him. And it became painful for him to even touch the ring. And then Gollum, well, Deagle first, but then Gollum comes across it. And it's happy to be with something nasty, something gross, something slimy, something a little bit more like Sauron, because it wasn't happy with Isildur. It didn't want to be with Isildur. Deagle and Smeagol were both nasty, but it wanted which one was stronger, which one's nastier. The one that's willing to kill his best friend, the one that could overpower his friend and kill him. That's why Smeagol or Gollum has the ring. But then after 500 years, it hasn't moved. It's no closer to returning to Sauron than it was before. So it finally abandons him. Gollum goes out and hunts, kills a goblin. In his excitement about his new meal, he doesn't notice that the ring has slipped off. Had he kept it on at all times, he probably would have been more aware. But he was, like I said, he hates the ring and he loves the ring, much like he hates himself and he loves himself. And we see all of that right here in this passage. All of it is there. All right. Let's see. Where were we? I think. Here we are.
No, not yet, precious, Gollum answered. We must search for it. It's lost.
But you never guessed my last question, and you promised, said Bilbo.
Never guessed,
said Gollum. Then suddenly out of the gloom came a sharp hiss.
What has it got in its pockets? Tell us that. It must tell first.
As far as Bilbo knew, there was no particular reason why he should not tell. Gollum's mind had jumped to a guess quicker than his, naturally, for Gollum had brooded for ages on this one thing, and he was always afraid of it being stolen. But Bilbo was annoyed at the delay. After all, he had won the game pretty fairly at a horrible risk. Answers were to be guessed, not given, he said.
But it wasn't a fair question, said Gollum. Not a riddle, precious, no.
Oh, well, it's a matter of ordinary questions, Bilbo replied. Then I asked one first. What have you lost? Tell me that.
What has it got in its pockets?
The sound came hissing louder and sharper, and he looked towards it. To his alarm, Bilbo now saw two small points of light peering at him. As suspicion grew in Gollum's mind, the light of his eyes burned with a pale flame. That's interesting. If you could send me that, I'm going to try to find like a reproduction of the first edition. "What have you lost?" Bilbo persisted. But now the light in the Gollum's eyes had become a green fire, and it was coming swiftly nearer. Gollum was in his boat again, paddling wildly back to the dark shore, and such a rage of loss and suspicion was in his heart that no sword had any more terror for him. Bilbo could not guess what had maddened the wretched creature, for he saw that all was up, and just as Gollum meant to murder him at any rate. Just in time he turned and ran blindly back up the dark passage down which he had come, keeping close to the wall and feeling it with his left hand.
"What has it got in its pockets?"
he heard him hiss loud behind him, and the splash as Gollum leapt from the boat.
"What have I
Sorry, it's not him. "What have I wonder?" he said to himself as he panted and stumbled along. He put his left hand in his pocket. The ring felt very cold as it quietly slipped onto his groping forefinger. The hiss was close behind him. He turned now and saw that Gollum's eyes like small green lamps coming up the slope. Terrified, he tried to run faster, but suddenly he struck his toes on a snag on the floor and fell flat with his little sword under him. In a moment Gollum was on him, but before Bilbo could do anything, recover his breath, pick himself up, or wave the sword, Gollum passed by, taking no notice of him, cursing and whispering as he ran. What could it mean? Gollum could see in the dark. Bilbo could see the light of his eyes palely shining even from behind. Painfully he got up and sheathed his sword, which was now glowing faintly again, and very cautiously he followed. There seemed nothing else to do. It was no good crawling back down to Gollum's water. Perhaps if he followed him, Gollum might lead him some way to escape without meaning to.
"Curse it, curse it, curse it," hissed Gollum. "Curse the Baggins, it's gone. What has it got in its pockets?" "Oh, we guess, my precious. He found it. Yes, he must have my birthday present."
Bilbo picked up his ears. He was at last beginning to guess himself. He hurried a little, getting as close as he dared behind Gollum, who was still going quickly, not looking back, but turning his head from side to side as Bilbo could see from the faint glimmer on the walls.
"My birthday present. Curse it. How did we lose it, my precious? Yes, that's it. We came this way at last when we twisted that nasty young squeaker. That's it, curse it. It slipped from us after all these ages and ages. It's gone.
Suddenly Gollum sat down and began to weep, a whistling and gurgling sound horrible to listen to. Bilbo halted and flattened himself against the tunnel wall. After a while Gollum stopped weeping and began to talk. He seemed to be having an argument with himself. "It's no good going back to search, no. We doesn't remember all the places we visited, and it's no use. The Baggins has got it in its pockets as the nasty little nurser has found it, we says. We guesses, precious, only guesses. We can't know till we find the nasty creature and squeezes it. But why does it know the present? But it doesn't know what the present can do, does it? It'll just keep it in its pockets. It doesn't know, and it can't go far. It lost itself, the nasty, nosy thing. It doesn't know the way out. It said so." "It said so, yes, but it's tricksy. It doesn't say what it means. It doesn't say what it's got in its pockets. It knows. It knows a way in. It must know a way out. Yes, it's off to the back door. To the back door, that's it. The Goblinses will catch it then. It can get out that way, precious. Goblinses. Yes, but if it's got the present, our precious present, then Goblinses will get it, Gollum. They'll find it, and they'll find out what it does. We shan't ever be safe again, never, Gollum. One of the Goblinses will put it on, and then no one will see him. He'll be there, but not see. Not even our clever eyes will notice him, and he'll come creepsy and tricksy and catch us, Gollum. Then let's stop talking, precious, and make haste. If the Baggins has gone that way, we must go and be quick and see. Go, not far now. Make haste." I need to give my throat a break there, and also comment on that. Thank you for those links. I do see them there. Okay, so this is the first example we see, the only example in this book, because we're just about done with Gollum's part, of him arguing with himself, of him having what we would come to understand as being a sort of fairy tale version of dissociative identity disorder, or what was formerly known as multiple personalities, where there's this sort of two sides to Gollum, and that he actually does talk to himself and answer himself in different voices. We see it very clearly in the Two Towers, and in the Return of the King as well. But especially in the Two Towers, he argues with himself. Samwise even gives the two distinct personalities names. He calls them Slinker and Stinker. And here we're actually seeing that here. He's arguing with himself. Now, this is exposition. There's no getting around that. This is exposition because Bilbo has to realize what the ring does. Not its main function, of course, but what it will do for him, that it will make him invisible. Otherwise, he's never having any reason to put it on. And he doesn't have any reason to use it for its invisibility. And the story really doesn't move forward. So for him to be able to escape and for him to be able to face all the dangers that he's going to face, he needs to figure out what the ring actually does. So Gollum sits down and exposits, basically saying if a goblin found the ring, it would put it on and it would disappear and no one would see it. So now we kind of know what the ring does because Gollum's saying it out loud. And it's not the clunkiest exposition out there because we know that Gollum talks to himself. It's already been established. And although this is the first time we're seeing him have a two-sided conversation or even argument, you might say, with himself, it is something that continues on into his appearance in the Two Towers. All right, let's move along here. With a spring, Gollum got up and started shambling off at a great pace. Bilbo hurried after him, still cautiously, though his chief fear was now of tripping on another snag and falling with a noise. His head was in a whirl of hope and wonder. It seemed that the ring he had was a magic ring. It made you invisible. He had heard of such things, of course, in old tales, but it was hard to believe that he had really found one by accident. Still, there it was. Gollum with his bright eyes had passed him by, only a yard to one side. On they went, Gollum flip-flapping ahead, hissing and cursing, Bilbo behind, going as softly as a hobbit can. Soon they came to places where, as Bilbo had noticed on the way down, side passages opened, this way and that. Gollum began at once to count them.
1 left, yes. 1 right, yes. 2 right, yes, yes. 2 left, yes, yes.
And so on. As the count grew, he slowed down, and he began to get shaky and weepy, for he was leaving the water further and further behind, and he was getting afraid. Goblins might be about, and he had lost his ring. At last he stopped by a low opening on their left as they went up.
7 right, yes. 6 left, yes, he whispered. This is it. This is the way to the back door. Yes, here's the passage.
He peered in and shrank back.
But we dursn't go in, precious. No, we dursn't. Goblins is down there. Lots of goblins is. We smells them. What shall we do? Curse them and crush them. We must wait here, precious. Wait a bit and see.
So they came to a dead stop. Gollum had brought Bilbo to the way out after all, but Bilbo could not get in. There was Gollum sitting humped up right in the opening, and his eyes gleamed cold in his head as he swayed it from side to side between his knees. Bilbo crept away from the wall more quietly than a mouse, but Gollum stiffened at once and sniffed, and his eyes went green. He hissed softly but menacingly. He could not see the hobbit, but now he was on the alert, and he had other senses that the darkness had sharpened, hearing and smell. He seemed to be crouched right down with his flat hand splayed on the floor, and his head thrust out, nose almost to the stone. Though he was only a black shadow in the gleam of his own eyes, Bilbo could see or feel that he was tense as a bowstring, gathered for a spring. Bilbo almost stopped breathing and went stiff himself. He was desperate. He must get away out of this horrible darkness while he had any strength left. He must fight. He must stab the foul thing, put its eyes out, kill it. It meant to kill him. No, not a fair fight. He was invisible now. Gollum had no sword. Gollum had not actually threatened to kill him or tried to yet. And he was miserable, alone, lost. A sudden understanding, a pity mixed with horror, welled up in Bilbo's heart. A glimpse of endless unmarked days without light or hope or betterment, hard stone, cold fish, sneaking and whispering, all these thoughts passed in the flash of a second. He trembled. And then quite suddenly, in another flash, as it lifted by a new strength and resolve, he leaped. Pausing here. This is the most important passage, possibly in the whole Legendarium. Definitely the most important passage in the Third Age. Not only is Bilbo refusing to kill Gollum, but he gives his reasons for mercy with a capital M, pity with the capital P. And we see that because Gollum is the one to destroy the ring in the end, Gollum destroys the ring, and he's only there because of the patience and the pity and the mercy of Bilbo, of Gandalf, of Aragorn, of Frodo, and of Sam as well. So we're seeing here one of these key moments, and it is brought up in the Fellowship of the Ring. Gandalf talks about this when Frodo says, it's a pity that Bilbo didn't kill Gollum when he had the chance. And Gandalf very rightly says, pity is what stayed his hand, and that's what this is referring to. No great leap for a man, but a leap in the dark. Straight over Gollum's head he jumped, 7 feet forward and 3 in the air indeed. Had he known it, he only just missed cracking his skull in the low arch of the passage. Gollum threw himself backwards and grabbed as the hobbit flew over him, but too late. His hand snapped on thin air, and Bilbo, falling fair on his sturdy feet, sped off down the new tunnel. He did not turn to see what Gollum was doing. There was a hissing and a cursing, almost as if his heels is first, but then it stopped. All at once there came a blood-curdling shriek filled with hatred and despair. Gollum was defeated. He dared go no further. He had lost his prey, and lost, too, the only thing he'd ever cared for, his precious. The cry brought Bilbo's heart to his mouth, but still he held on. Now faint as an echo, but menacing, the voice came behind.
Thief, Baggins. We hates it forever.
There was a silence, but that too seemed menacing to Bilbo. If goblins are so near that he smelt them, he thought, then they'll have heard his shrieking and cursing. Careful now, or this way will lead you to worse things. The passage was low and roughly made. It was not too difficult for the hobbit, especially when, in spite of all care, he stubbed his poor toes again, several times on nasty, jagged stones in the floor. A bit low for goblins, at least for the big ones, thought Bilbo, not knowing that even the big ones, the orcs of the mountains, could go along at great speed, stooping low with their hands almost on the ground. Soon the passage that had been sloping down began to go up again, and after a while it climbed steeply. That slowed Bilbo down, but at last the slope stopped. The passage turned a corner and dipped down again, and there, at the bottom of a short incline, he saw, filtering round another corner, a glimpse of light. Not red light, as of fire or a lantern, but a pale, out-of-doors sort of light. Then Bilbo began to run. Scuttling as fast as his legs would carry him, he turned the last corner and came suddenly right into an open space, where the light, after all that time in the dark, seemed dazzlingly bright. Really, it was only a leak of sunshine through a doorway where a great door, a stone door, was left standing open. Bilbo blinked, and then suddenly he saw the goblins. Goblins in full armor with drawn swords, sitting just inside the door and watching it with wide eyes, and watching the passage that led to it. They were aroused, alert, ready for anything. They saw him sooner than he saw them. Yes, they saw him. Whether it was an accident or a last trick of the ring before it took a new master, it was not on his finger. With yells of delight, the goblins rushed upon him. A pang of fear and loss, like an echo of Gollum's misery, smote Bilbo. And forgetting even to draw his sword, he struck his hands into his pockets, and there was the ring still in his left pocket, and slipped it on his finger. The goblins stopped short. They could not see a sign of him. He had vanished. They yelled twice as loud as before, but not so delightedly. "Where is it?" they cried. "Go back up the passage," some shouted. "This way," some yelled. "That way," others yelled. "Look out for the door," bellowed the captain. Whistles blew, armor clashed, swords rattled, goblins cursed and swore and ran hither and thither, falling over one another and getting very angry. There was a terrible outcry, to-do and disturbance. Bilbo was dreadfully frightened, but he had sense to understand what had happened, and he snuck behind a big barrel which had held drink for the goblin guards, and so get out of the way and avoid being bumped into, tramped to death, or caught by feel. "I must get to the door, I must get to the door," he kept on saying to himself. But it was not a long time before he ventured to try. But it was a long time before he ventured to try. Then it was like a horrible game of blind men's bluff. The place was full of goblins running about, and the poor little hobbit dodged this way and that, was knocked over by a goblin who could not make out what he had bumped into, scrambled away on all fours, slipped between the legs of the captain just in time, got up and ran for the door. It was still ajar, but a goblin had pushed it nearly to. Bilbo struggled, but he could not move it. He tried to squeeze through the crack. He squeezed, and he stuck. It was awful. His buttons had gotten wedged on the edge of the door and the doorpost. He could see just outside into the open air. There were a few steps running down a narrow valley between tall mountains. The sun came out from behind a cloud and shone bright on the outside of the door. But he could still not get through. Suddenly, one of the goblins inside shouted, "There's a shadow by the door. Something's outside." Bilbo's heart jumped into his mouth. He gave a terrific squirm. Buttons burst off in all directions. He was through, and with a torn coat and waistcoat, leaping down the steps like a goat, while bewildered goblins were still picking up his nice brass buttons on the doorstep. Of course, they soon came down after him, hooting and hollowing and hunting among the trees. But they don't like the sun. It makes their legs wobble and their heads giddy. They could not find Bilbo with the ring on, slipping in and out of the shadows of the trees, running as quick and quiet, and keeping out of the sun, so soon they went back grumbling and cursing to guard the door. Bilbo had escaped. So that's the end of that chapter. That's Gollum's chapter. That's Riddles in the Dark, and it's very interesting. Obviously, I had to pause multiple times because there's a lot of very important things happen here regarding Gollum, regarding the ring and everything. Not a lot to say about the remaining part, except for the idea that the ring slipped off his finger. Now, Bilbo sort of gives us the theory that maybe it was a quirk of the ring, accepting a new master, but Bilbo is not the master of the ring. He's not the Lord of the Rings. Neither was Gollum. It just slipped off his finger. He even found it in his pocket. So, this is the first idea that the ring can actually do this, that it could grow larger, change its shape, slip off of him. Okay. Chapter 6, Out of the Frying Pan into the Fire. Bilbo had escaped the golems, but he did not know where he was. He had lost hood, cloak, food, pony, his buttons, and his friends. He wandered on and on till the sun began to sink westwards, behind the mountains. Their shadows fell across Bilbo's path, and he looked back. Then he looked forward and could see, before him, only ridges and slopes falling through low lands and plains glimpsed occasionally between the trees. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed. "I seem to have gotten right to the other side of the misty mountains, right to the edge of the land beyond. Where an Oak and Gandalf and the dwarves have got to. I only hope to goodness they were not still back there in the power of the goblins." He still wandered on out of the little high valley, over its edge and down the slopes beyond, but all the while a very uncomfortable thought was growing inside him. He wondered whether he ought not, now that he had the magic ring, to go back into the horrible, horrible tunnels and look for his friends. He had just made up his mind that it was his duty, that he must turn back, and very miserable he felt about it when he heard voices. He stopped and listened. It did not sound like goblins, so he crept forward carefully. He was on a stony path winding downwards with a rocky wall in the left land. On the other side, the ground sloped away, and there were dells below the level of the path, overhung with bushes and low trees. In one of these dells, under the bushes, people were talking. He crept still nearer, and suddenly he saw peering between two big boulders a head with a red hood on. It was Balin, doing lookout. He could have clapped and shouted for joy, but he did not. He had still got the ring on for fear of meeting something unexpected and unpleasant, and he saw that Balin was looking straight at him without noticing him. "I will give them all a surprise," he thought, as he crawled to the bushes at the edge of the dell. Gandalf was arguing with the dwarves. They were discussing all that had happened to them in the tunnels, and wondering and debating what they were to do now. The dwarves were grumbling, and Gandalf was saying they could not possibly go on their journey, leaving Mr. Baggins in the hand of the goblins, without trying to find him if he was alive or dead, and without trying to rescue him. "After all, he is my friend," said the wizard, "and not a bad little chap. I feel responsible for him. I wish to goodness you had not lost him." The dwarves wanted to know why he had ever been brought at all, why he could not stick to his friends and come along with them, and why the wizard had not chosen someone with more sense. "He has been more trouble than use so far," said one. "If we had got back now into those abominable tunnels to look for him, then drat him, I say." Gandalf answered angrily, "I brought him, and I don't bring things that are of no use. If you help me to look for him, I will go and leave you here to get out of the mess as best as you can yourselves. If we can only find him again, you will thank me before all is over. Whatever did you want to go and drop him for, Dory?" "You would have dropped him," said Dory, "if a goblin had suddenly grabbed your legs from behind in the dark, tripped up your feet, and kicked you in the back." "Then why didn't you pick him up again?" "Good heavens, can you ask? Goblins fighting and biting in the dark? Everybody falling over bodies and hitting one another? You nearly chopped off my head with Glamdring, and Thorin was stabbing here and there and everywhere with Orcrist. All of a sudden you gave one of your blinding flashes, and we saw the goblins running back yelping. You shouted, 'Follow me, everybody,' and everybody ought to have followed. We thought everybody had. There was no time to count, as you know quite well, till we had dashed through the gate guards, out of the lower door, and helter-skelter down here. And here we are, without the burglar, come fusticate him. And here is the burglar, said Bilbo, stepping into the middle of them and slipping off the ring. Bless me, how they jumped. Then they shouted with surprise and delight. Gandalf was as astonished as any of them, but probably more pleased than all the others. He called to Balin and told him what he thought a lookout man who let people walk right into them like that without warning. It is a fact that Bilbo's reputation went up a very great deal with the dwarves after this. If they had doubted that he was really a first-class burglar in spite of Gandalf's words, they doubted no longer. Balin was the most puzzled of all, but everyone said it was a very clever bit of work. Indeed, Bilbo was so pleased with their praise that he just chuckled inside and said nothing whatever about the ring. And when they asked him how he did it, he said, "Oh, just crept along, very carefully and quietly." "Well, it is the first time that even a mouse has crept along carefully and quietly under my very nose and not have been spotted," said Balin. "And I take off my hood to you," which he did. "Balin at your service," he said. "Your servant, Mr. Baggins," said Bilbo. Then they wanted to know all about his adventures since they had lost him, and he sat down and told them everything, except about the finding of the ring. Not just now, he thought. They were particularly interested in the riddle competition and shuddered most appreciatively at his description of Gollum. "And then I couldn't think of any other question with him sitting beside me," ended Bilbo. "So I said, 'What is in my pocket?' And he couldn't guess in 3 goes. So I said, 'What about your promise? Show me the way out.' But he came at me to kill me, and I ran and fell over, and he missed me in the dark. Then I followed him because I heard him talking to himself. He thought I really knew the way out, and so he was making for it. And then he sat down in the entrance, and I could not get by, so I jumped over him and escaped, and ran down to the gate." "What about the guards?" they asked. "Weren't there any?" "Oh, yes, lots of them, but I dodged them. I got stuck in the door, which was only open a crack, and I lost lots of buttons," he said sadly, looking at his torn clothes. "But I squeezed through all right, and here I am." The dwarves looked at him with quite a new respect. When he talked about dodging guards, jumping over Gollum, and squeezing through, as if it was not very difficult or very alarming. "What did I tell you?" said Gandalf, laughing. "Mr. Baggins has more about him than you guess." He gave Bilbo a queer look from under his bushy eyebrows as he said this, but the hobbit wondered if he had guessed at the part of his tale that he had left out. Okay, just pause here and talk about it. So, see, Gandalf's giving him a weird look. And what we learn later is that Gandalf 100% knows that Bilbo is not telling the whole truth. In fact, we learn later that Bilbo outright lied. He not only did not mention the ring, but he made Gollum out to be very different in his story. And when he later does reveal the ring, he tells a story that has Gollum wanting to actually give it as a prize, and having not been able to find it, he instead chose to let him out, and that's the first edition version. But it even clashes with what is said here, which tells us that this part was altered too, because this part makes it seem like he's telling something much, much closer to the truth. That Gollum came at him like that, and that he had to escape. All right, let's continue. Then he had questions of his own to ask, for if Gandalf had explained it all by now to the dwarves, Bilbo had not heard it. He wanted to know how the wizard had turned up again, and where they had got to now. The wizard, to tell the truth, never minded explaining his cleverness more than once, so now he told Bilbo that both he and Elrond had been well aware of the presence of evil goblins in that part of the mountains, but their main gate used to come out of a different pass, one more easy to travel by, so that they often caught people benighted by their gates. Evidently, people had given up going that way, and the goblins must have opened their new entrance at the top of the pass the dwarves had taken, quite recently, because it had been found quite safe up to now. "I must see if I can't find a more or less decent giant to block it up again," said Gandalf. "Or soon there will be no getting over the mountains at all." As soon as Gandalf had heard Bilbo's yell, he realized what had happened. In the flash which killed the goblins, that were grabbing him, he had nipped inside the crack just as it snapped to. He followed after the drivers and prisoners right to the edge of the great hall, and there he sat and worked up his best magic he could in the shadows. A very ticklish business it was," he said. "Touch and go." But of course Gandalf had made a special study of bewitchments with fire and lights. Even the hobbit had never forgotten the magic fireworks at Old Took's Midsummer Eve parties, as you remember. The rest we all know, except that Gandalf knew all about the back door, as the goblins called the lower gate, where Bilbo lost his buttons. As a matter of fact, it was well known to anybody who was acquainted with this part of the mountains, but it took a wizard to keep his head in the tunnels and guide them in the right direction. "They made that gate ages ago," he said. "Partly for a way of escape, if they needed one, partly as a way out into the lands beyond, where they still come into the dark and do great damage. They guard it always, and no one has ever managed to block it up. They will guard it doubly after this," he laughed. All the others laughed too. After all, they had lost a great deal, but they had killed the great goblin and a great many others besides, and they had all escaped, so they might have been said to have had the best of it so far. But the wizard called them to their senses. "We must be getting out at once. Now we're a little rested," he said. "They will be out after us in hundreds when night comes on, and already shadows are lengthening. They can smell our footsteps for hours and hours after we've passed. We must be miles on before dusk. There will be a bit of moon, if it keeps fine, and that is lucky. Not that they mind the moon much, but it will give us a little light to steer by." "Oh, yes," he said in answer to more questions from the hobbit. "You lose track of time inside goblin tunnels. Today's Thursday, and it was Monday night or Tuesday morning that we were captured. We have gone miles and miles, come right out through the heart of the mountains, and are now on the other side. Quite a short cut. But we are not at the point at which our paths would have brought us. We are too far to the north, and have had some awkward country ahead. And we're still pretty high up. Let's get on." "I'm so dreadfully hungry," groaned Bilbo, who was suddenly aware that he had not had a meal since the night before last. Just think of that for a hobbit. His stomach felt all empty and loose and his legs all wobbly now that the excitement was over. "Can't help it," said Gandalf, "unless you like to go back and ask the goblins nicely to let you have your pony back and your luggage." "No, thank you," said Bilbo. "Very well, then, we must tighten our belts and trudge on, or we shall be made into supper, and that will be much worse than having none ourselves." As they went on, Bilbo looked from side to side for something to eat, but the blackberries were still only in flower, and of course there were no nuts, not even hawthorn berries. He nibbled a bit of sorrel, and he drank from a small mountain stream that crossed his path, and he ate 3 wild strawberries that he found on its bank, but it was not much good. They still went on and on. The rough path disappeared. The bushes and the long grasses between the boulders, the patches of rabbit-cropped turf, the thyme and sage and the marjoram and the yellow rock roses all vanished, and they found themselves at the top of a wide, steep slope of fallen stones, the remains of a landslide. When they began to go down this, rubbish and small pebbles rolled away from their feet. Soon larger bits of split stone went clattering down and started other pieces below them slithering and rolling. Then lumps of rock were disturbed and bounded off, crashing down with a dust and a noise. Before long, the whole slope above them and below them seemed on the move, and they were sliding away, huddled all together in a fearful confusion of slipping, rattling, cracking slabs and stones. And that strawberry must have been good, right? That must have been a very good strawberry. It was the trees at the bottom that saved them. They slid into the edge of a climbing wood of pines that here stood right up the mountain slope from the deeper, darker forests of the valleys below. Some caught hold of the trunks and swung themselves into lower branches. Some, like the little hobbit, got behind a tree to shelter themselves from the onslaught of the rocks. Soon the danger was over. The slide had stopped, and last faint crashes would be heard as the largest of the disturbed stones went bounding and spinning among the bracken and the pine roots far below. "Oh, that has got us on a bit," said Gandalf. "And even goblins tracking us will have a job to come down here quietly." "I dare say," grumbled Bomber. "But they won't find it difficult to send stones bouncing down on our heads." The dwarves and Bilbo were feeling far from happy, and were rubbing their bruised and damaged legs and feet. "Nonsense. We're going to turn aside here out of the path of the slide. We must be quick. Look at the light." The sun had long gone down behind the mountains. Already the shadows were deepening about them, though far away through the trees and over the black tops of those growing lower down they could still see the evening lights of the plains beyond. They limped along now as fast as they were able down the gentle slopes of a pine forest in a slanting path leading steadily southwards. At times they were pushing through a sea of bracken and tall fronds rising above the hobbit's head. At times they were marching along quiet as quiet over a floor of pine needles, and all the while the forest got heavier and the forest silence deeper. There was no wind that evening to bring even a sea sighing into the branches of the trees. "Must we go any further?" asked Bilbo, when it was so dark that he could only just see Thorin's beard wagging beside him. and so quiet that he could hear the dwarves breathing like a loud noise. "My toes are all bruised and bent, and my legs ache, and my stomach is wagging like an empty sack." "A bit further," said Gandalf. After what seemed like ages further, they came suddenly to an opening where no trees grew. The moon was up and shining in the clearing. Somehow it struck them all as to not be at It struck them all of them as to not at all be a nice place, although there was nothing wrong to see. All of a sudden they heard a howl away down the hill, a long, shuddering howl. It was answered by another away to the right and a good deal nearer to them, then by another not far away to the left. It was wolves howling at the moon, wolves gathering together. There were no wolves living near Mr. Baggins's hole at home, but he knew the noise. He had heard it described to him often enough in tales. One of his elder cousins on the Took's side, who had been a great traveller, used to imitate it to frighten him. To hear it out in the forest under the moon was too much for Bilbo. Even magic rings are not much use against wolves, especially against the evil packs that live under the shadow of the goblin-infested mountains over the edge of the wild, on the borders of the unknown. Wolves of that sort smell keener than goblins, and they do not need to see you to catch you. "What shall we do? What shall we do?" he cried. "Escaping goblins to be caught by wolves," he said. And it became a proverb, though we now say, out of the frying pan into the fire in the same sort of uncomfortable situations. "Up the trees, quick," said Gandalf. And they ran to the trees at the edge of the glade, hunting for those that had branches fairly low or slender enough to swarm up. They found them as quick as ever they could, you can guess, and up they went as high as they ever could trust the branches. You would have laughed, from a safe distance, if you had seen the dwarves sitting up in the trees with their beards dangling down, like old gentlemen gone cracked and playing at being boys. Fili and Kili were at the top of a tall larch, like an enormous Christmas tree. Dori, Nori, Ori, Oin, and Gloin are the most comfortable in a huge pine tree with regular branches sticking out at intervals like the spokes of a wheel. Bifur, Bofur, Bombur, and Thorin were in another. Dwalin and Balin had swarmed up a tall, slender fir, with a few branches, and were trying to find a place to sit in the greenery of the topmost boughs. Gandalf, who was a good deal taller than the others, had found a tree into which they could not climb, a large pine standing at the very edge of the glade. He was quite hidden in its boughs, but you could see his eyes gleaming in the moon as he peeped out. And Bilbo! He could not get into any tree, and was scuttling about from trunk to trunk like a rabbit that has lost its hole, and has a dog after it. Okay. I need to pause to drink some water here. My throat is getting quite harsh here. As usual, I blame Gollum. It's interesting that they mentioned a Christmas tree. Obviously, the idea of there being Christmas in Middle-earth is pretty absurd. We learn later in The Lord of the Rings that the winter solstice festival is called Yule in Middle-earth, which makes perfect sense since it's a pagan holiday. And although The Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's Hobbit, the Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's Legendarium in general is a very, very Christian work, a very Catholic work, it is also a very pagan work, because Tolkien and C.S. Lewis as well were these sort of guys that believed that paganism was at the root of Christianity, and thus were, if you don't understand paganism, that you don't understand Christianity. So Yule being mentioned makes perfect sense. Christmas tree was probably Tolkien's way of describing it to his children, to put an image in the head of like Michael and Christopher and whatnot, and to the reader as well. We hear Christmas tree, and you know exactly what a Christmas tree looks like. They could have used another word, but like I said, The Hobbit is a very different work. Middle-earth is not mentioned, the Shire is not mentioned. It was not yet very connected to the rest of the Legendarium. It became very well connected, and even at this point, it is connected in its own way. I mean, Elrond is in it. And when we get to the Mirkwood section, there's this particular paragraph that I'm going to highlight and analyze very closely, because there is a description of the Sylvan Elves that basically gives you the history of the Sundering of the Elves. It gives you the Quenta Silmarillion condensed into a single paragraph told by Bilbo. And it's kind of amazing that if you read the Silmarillion and then you go back and you read the Lord of the Rings, it's pretty amazing. But also if you go back and you read the Hobbit after reading the Silmarillion, it's pretty amazing what you can catch in the little references and such. So Christmas tree is an odd choice, but it's also interesting that Bilbo mentions that there aren't wolves in the Shire, that he's never seen a wolf, that he's never heard a wolf. His cousin used to imitate a wolf to scare him. We know that there was in the past, long before Bilbo was born, that wolves did come into the Shire, that they actually invaded the Shire when there was a particularly nasty winter that froze the water. And the wolves came over the ice and attacked the Shire, and the hobbits had to fight back. And it was used as an example of hobbits having a bit of autonomy and a bit of being sovereign in their own space, and that they were really not the pushovers that outsiders thought they were, that they were able to fight off the wild wargs. There's, of course, the story of Bandabras Tuk, who cleaved off a goblin's head with his club and sent it flying into a rabbit hole. The goblin's name was Golfinbull, so they came up with Golf. There was a reference here about escaping from goblins to be caught by wolves, which became the aphorism, out of the frying pan into the fire. So we're sort of seeing like these origins of things that is very interesting, and it goes into the author's conceit of this being the past, of this being a mythology of Celtic lore, of Europe, and of the world in general. All right, let's continue. "You've left the burglar behind again," said Nori to Dori, looking down. "I can't always be carrying burglars on my back," said Dori. "Down tunnels and up trees? What do you think I am, a porter?" "He'll be eaten if we don't do something," said Thorin. For there were howls all around them now, getting nearer and nearer. "Dori," he called, for Dori was lowest down in the easiest tree. "Be quick and give Mr. Baggins a hand up." Dori was really a decent fellow in spite of his grumbling. Poor Bilbo could not reach his hand even when he climbed down to the bottom branch and hung his arm down as far as he ever could. So Dori actually climbed out of the tree and let Bilbo scramble up and stand on his back. Just at that moment the wolves trotted, howling into the clearing. All of a sudden there were hundreds of eyes looking at them. Still Dori did not let Bilbo down. He waited till he had clambered off his shoulders into the branches, and then he jumped for the branches himself. Only just in time, a wolf snapped at his cloak as he swung up and nearly got him. In a minute there was a whole pack of them yelping all around the tree and leaping out of the trunk with eyes blazing and tongues hanging out. But even the wild wargs, for so the evil wolves over the edge of the wild were named, cannot climb trees. For a time they were safe. Luckily it was warm and not windy. Trees are not very comfortable to sit in for long at any time, but in the cold and the wind with wolves all around below waiting for you, they can be perfectly miserable places. This glade in the ring of trees was evidently a meeting place of the wolves. More and more kept coming in. They left guards at the foot of the tree in which Dori and Bilbo were, and then went snuffing about until they had smelt out every tree that had anyone in it. These they guarded too, while all the rest, hundreds and hundreds it seemed, went and sat in a great circle in the glade, and in the middle of the circle was a great grey wolf. He spoke to them in the dreadful language of the wargs. Gandalf understood it. Bilbo did not, but it sounded terrible to him, and as if all their talk was about cruel and wicked things, as it was. Every now and then the wargs in the circle would answer their grey chief all together, and their dreadful clamour almost made the hobbit fall out of his pine tree. I will tell you what Gandalf heard, though Bilbo did not understand it. The wargs and the goblins often helped one another in wicked deeds. Goblins do not usually venture very far from the mountains unless they are driven out and are looking for new homes or are marching to war, which I'm glad to say has not happened for a very long while. But in those days, they sometimes used to go on raids, especially to get foods or slaves to work for them. Then they often got the wargs to help and shared the plunder with them. Sometimes they rode on wolves like men do on horses. Now it seemed that a great goblin raid had been planned for that very night. The wargs had come to meet the goblins, and the goblins were late. The reason, no doubt, was the death of the great goblin and all the excitement caused by the dwarves and Bilbo and the wizard, for whom they were probably still hunting. In spite of the dangers of this far land, bold men had late been making their way back into it from the south, cutting down trees and building themselves places to live, in among the more pleasant woods in the valleys and among the river shores. There were many of them, and they were brave and well armed, and even the wargs dared not attack them if there were many together, or in the bright day. But now they had planned, with the goblins' help, to come by night upon some of the villagers nearest to the mountain. If their plans had been carried out, there would have been none left there the next day. All would have been killed except the few goblins left from the wolves, and carried back as prisoners to their caves. This was dreadful talk to listen to, not only because of the brave woodsmen and their wives and children, but also because of the danger which now threatened Gandalf and his friends. The wargs were angry and puzzled at finding them here in their very meeting place. They thought they were friends of the woodsmen, who would come to spy on them, and would take news of their plans down into the valleys, and then the goblins and wolves would have to fight a terrible battle instead of capturing prisoners and devouring people waked suddenly from their sleep. So the wargs had no intention of going away and letting the people up the trees escape, at any rate not until morning. And long before that, they said, goblin soldiers would be coming down the mountains, and goblins can climb trees, or cut them down. Now you can understand why Gandalf, listening to their growling and yelping, began to be dreadfully afraid, wizard though he was, and to feel that they were in a very bad place, and had not yet escaped at all. All the time he was not going to let them have it all their own way, though he could not do very much stuck up in a tall tree with wolves all around in the ground below. He gathered the huge pine cones from the branches of the tree. Then he set one alight with bright blue fire and threw it, whizzing down among the circle of the wolves. It struck one in the back, and immediately his shaggy coat caught fire, and he was leaping to and fro, yelping horribly. Then another came, and another, one in blue flames, one in red, another in green. They burst on the ground in the middle of the circle and went off in colored sparks and smoke. A especially large one hit the chief wolf on the nose, and he leaped in the air 10 feet, and then rushed around and around the circle, biting and snapping, even at the other wolves in his anger and fright. The dwarves and Bilbo shouted and cheered. The rage of the wolves was terrible to see, and the commotion they made filled the forest. Wolves are afraid of fire at all times, but this was a most horrible and uncanny fire. If a spark got in their coats, it stuck and burned into them, and unless they rolled over quick, they were soon all in flames. Very soon, all about the glade, wolves were rolling over and over to put out the sparks in their backs, while those that were burning were running around, howling, and setting others alight, till their own friends chased them away, and they fled off down the slopes, crying and yammering and looking for water. "What is all this uproar in the forest tonight?" said the Lord of the Eagles. He was sitting, black in the moonlight, at the top of a lonely pinnacle of rock in the eastern edge of the mountains. "I hear wolves' voices, and the goblins are at mischief in the woods." He swept into the air, and immediately 2 of his guards from the rocks at either hand leaped up to follow him. They circled in the sky and looked down upon the ring of the wargs, a tiny spot far, far below. But eagles have keen eyes and can see small things at great distance. The Lord of the Eagles of the Misty Mountains had eyes that could look upon the sun unblinking, and could see a rabbit moving on the ground a mile below even in the moonlight. So though he could not see people in the trees, he could make out the commotion among the wolves and see tiny flashes of fire, and hear the howling and yelping coming up faint far beneath him. And he could see the glint of the moon on goblin spears and helmets, and long lines of the wicked folk crept down on the hillsides from their gate and wound up into the wood. Eagles are not kindly birds. Some are cowardly and cruel, but the ancient race of the northern mountains are the greatest of all birds. They were proud and strong and noble-hearted. They did not love goblins or fear them. When they took notice of them at all, which was seldom, for they did not eat such creatures, they swooped on them and drove them shrieking back into their caves, and stopped whatever wickedness they were doing. The goblins hated the eagles and feared them, but could not reach their lofty seats or drive them from the mountains. So, I do have to pause here and comment on this. So, it's interesting here. This is a very almost awkward sort of section here where the perspective suddenly shifts. We're with Gandalf. First we're with Bilbo, and it explains why we're going from Bilbo's perspective to Gandalf's perspective, because Gandalf can understand the language of the wolves and Bilbo cannot. So that's explained. But it always seemed very jarring to me that suddenly a character named the Lord of the Eagles is speaking. It seems very, very left-turned. And this, of course, we know this character is Gwaihir. And the nature of the eagles is really interesting. Here they say they're not kindly, they're proud. And it's an interesting thought because we think of the eagles as being very noble. And it ties into the eagle question. And I think the next time that I tackle the eagle question, whenever I get that eagle question, why didn't the eagles fly them to Mordor? Why didn't they just do that? And every time I tackle it, I try to come at it from a different angle. Because there are so very many reasons why it wouldn't work, why it couldn't happen. And I think next time I answer that question, I'm going to answer it with the very first introduction of the eagles as a race in The Hobbit. Eagles are not kindly birds. Some are cowardly and cruel. It does seem to contradict the Silmarillion. It doesn't contradict the Lord of the Rings very much, but it contradicts the Silmarillion, where we learn that they are the servants of Manwë. And that Tolkien had this idea initially that they were Maya spirits, just like Gandalf is, that they are basically angels that happen to be in the form of eagles. And then later he changed his mind that they were just birds, but of a higher order. And then later still, he changed his mind back. The book, The Nature of Middle-earth, which came out a few years ago, had some of his very last writings, and in that he does explicitly refer to the eagles as Maiar spirits. I wonder always if that includes Huan as well. Huan was a great dog from the Silmarillion that was initially going to be a Maiar, and then he was just a dog of a higher order. And I wonder if we can assume that Huan from the story Beren and Luthien is indeed a Maiar based on that. But it's just interesting how it just suddenly goes to the Lord of the Eagles. It doesn't introduce him. It doesn't say, high atop the mountains there was a bird, the Lord of the Eagles, and he was watching. It just goes right into the dialogue. What is all this uproar in the forest tonight, said the Lord of the Eagles. It's a very young Tolkien writing something for his children and not thinking of it being scrutinized all that much. He would never imagine, first of all, he would never imagine a concept such as Twitch or YouTube. And even if he was, he would probably never imagine that somebody would be sitting here not only reading The Hobbit, of all things, to other people, but analyzing it and scrutinizing it so closely, because to him this was a children's story. And that doesn't mean that it's unintelligent or that it's bad, but that it's suitable for children. And thus, we do allow for some sort of leaps of faith like this, or leaps into faith, so to speak, where we can just say, well, there were eagles, and we're just suddenly shifting perspective, and this is the way that Bilbo chose to tell the story, or this is the way that Tolkien chose to translate the story. But yeah, the depiction of the eagles here is very interesting. It does seem to contradict the Silmarillion in the way that in the Silmarillion we learned that the eagles are always very concerned with the goblins. They are always hunting them. The story, The Fall of Gondolin, most particularly the unfinished final version, which you can find in Unfinished Tales, this is the story of Tur and his coming to Gondolin. And Tur is traveling with his elf friend from the sea to Gondolin after meeting with Ulmo, and he comes across Turin at one point, but then he also comes to this land where there are many, many orcs, goblins, orcs, whatever you want to call them, and they have to travel very silently and very quietly and very stealthily, which is difficult because it's winter. And then they come to a land where there's a lot of eagles, and they feel very safe. And they suddenly no longer have to travel in this stealthy manner because Tur and Voranwa have realized that if there are eagles around, there are no goblins, because they always hunt the goblins. So, hearing here, I mean, it says that they hated and feared the goblins. They may have hated them. They certainly didn't fear them. But it also says here that they don't take much notice of goblins because to them the goblins are not food. How do we reconcile this with the Silmarillion? And it's very simple. This is Bilbo's perspective. That's the only way to reconcile The Hobbit and the Silmarillion here. It's just, this is Bilbo's perspective. This is not the true story, and we know it's not the true story because Gandalf said so. There's a story in Unfinished Tales called The Quest for Erebor, which takes place roughly towards the end of The Return of the King, when Frodo was resting in Minas Tirith before he returned home. And in that story, Gandalf speaks greatly of Bilbo and the way that he told his story and how it wasn't true, and how the account in The Hobbit is not how it happened. It's vaguely how it happened. The events certainly all happened, but we learn that the characters were not the way that Bilbo depicted them, and that Bilbo was more interested in telling a story than writing a chronicle. And that's interesting, because then he translated the Silmarillion, which is a chronicle more than a story. But let's continue along here. Notice that the Lord of the Eagles, by the way, is never named. We don't hear the name Gwei here. We only hear the Lord of the Eagles. Tonight the Lord of the Eagles was filled with curiosity to know what was afoot. So he summoned many other eagles to him, and they flew away from the mountains, and slowly circling ever round and round, they came down, 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 toward the ring of the wolves and the meeting place of the goblins. A very good thing, too. Dreadful things had been going on down there. The wolves that had caught fire had fled into the forest, and had set it alight in several places. It was high summer, and on the eastern side of the mountains there had been little rain for some time. Yellowing bracken, falling branches, deep-piled pine needles, and here and there dead trees were soon in flames. All round the clearing of the wargs fire was leaping, but the wolf guards did not leave the trees. Maddened and angry, they were leaping and howling round the trunks and cursing the dwarves in their horrible language, with their tongues hanging out and their eyes shining as red, as fierce as the flames. Then suddenly goblins came running up yelling. They thought a battle with the woodmen was going on, but they soon learned what had really happened. Some of them actually sat down and laughed. Others waved their spears and clashed the shafts against their shields. Goblins are not afraid of fire, and they soon had a plan which seemed to them most amusing. Some got all the wolves together in a pack. Some stacked fern and brushwood round the tree trunks. Others rushed round and stamped and beat and stamped until nearly all the flames were put out, but they did not put out the fire nearest to the trees where the dwarves were. That fire they fed with leaves and dead branches and bracken. Soon they had a ring of smoke and flame all around the dwarves, a ring which they kept from spreading outward, but it closed slowly in, till the running fire was licking the fuel piled under the trees. Smoke was in Bilbo's eyes. He could feel the heat of the flames, and through the reek he could see the goblins dancing round and round in a circle like people round a midsummer bonfire. Outside the ring of dancing warriors with spears and axes stood the wolves at a respectful distance, watching and waiting. He could hear the goblins beginning a horrible song. 15 birds and 5 fir trees. Their feathers were fanned in a fiery breeze. But funny little birds, they had no wings. Or what shall we do with these funny little things? Roast them alive, or stew them in a pot, fry them, boil them, and eat them hot? Then they stopped and shouted out, "Fly away, little birds, fly away if you can. Come down, little birds, or you will get roasted in your nests. Sing, sing, little birds, why don't you sing?" "Go away, little boys," shouted Gandalf in answer. "It isn't bird nesting time. Oh, so naughty little boys that play with fire get punished." He said it to make them angry and to show them he was not frightened of them, though of course he was, wizard though he was. But they took no notice, and they went on singing, "Burn, burn, tree and fern, shrivel and scorch a fizzling torch, to light the night for our delight, aye. Bake 'em and toast 'em, fry 'em and roast 'em, with beards blaze, eyes glaze, with till hair smells and skins crack, fat melts and bones black. In cinders lie beneath the sky, so dwarves shall die, and light the night for our delight, yah-hey, yah-harry-hey, yah-hey." So, absolutely, I'm going to pause here anyway. The unreliable narrator, we spoke about this at length during the Council of Tolkien, that there are several instances of unreliable narration, and The Hobbit is all unreliable narration, and Lord of the Rings has several instances of it. The Silmarillion even has it. And some of it, in the Silmarillion at least, some of it is error. Some of it is the fact that the Silmarillion was never finished. And it was edited together from various drafts. And some choices that were made were later found to be not the greatest choices. But in The Lord of the Rings and in The Hobbit and in many of the stories, the unreliable narrator is absolutely a choice. Now, I just want to point out, this is a very dark song. Very gruesome song that the goblins are singing. They're talking about beards on fire, your hair smelling from burning, your skin cracking, your fat melting, your bones turning black. It's grisly, and it's almost too grisly for this particular story. It almost seems like something out of the Silmarillion, really. And without Yehoy, the flames were under Gandalf's tree. In a moment it spread to the others. The bark caught fire, the lower branches cracked. Then Gandalf climbed the top of his tree. The sudden splendor flashed from his wand like lightning as he got ready to spring down from on high right among the spears of the goblins. That would have been the end of him, though he would probably have killed many of them had he come hurtling down like a thunderbolt. But he never leaped. Just at that moment the Lord of the Eagles swept down from above, seized him in his talons, and was gone. There was a howl of anger and surprise from the goblins. Loud cried Lord of the Eagles, to whom Gandalf had now spoken. Back swept the great birds that were with him, and down they came like huge black shadows. The wolves yammered and gnashed their teeth, the goblins yelled and stamped with rage, and flung their heavy spears in the air in vain. Over them swooped the eagles. The dark rush of their beating wings smote them to the floor, or drove them far away. Their talons tore at the goblins' faces. Other birds flew to the treetops and seized the dwarves, who were scrambling up now as far as they ever dared to go. Poor little Bilbo was very nearly left behind again. He just managed to catch hold of Dory's legs as Dory's borne off last of all, and up they went together above the tumult and the burning, Bilbo swinging in the air with his arms nearly breaking. Now far below, the goblins and the wolves are scattering far and wide in the woods, a few eagles still circling and sweeping above the battleground. The flames about the trees sprang suddenly up among the highest branches. They went up in crackling fire. There was a sudden flurry of sparks and smoke. Bilbo had escaped just in time. Soon the light of the burning was a faint glow, a red twinkle on the back floor, and they were high up in the sky, rising all the time in a strong sweeping circles. Bilbo never forgot that flight, clinging onto Dory's ankles. He moaned, my arms, but Dory groaned, my poor legs, my poor legs. At the best of times, heights made Bilbo giddy. He used to turn queer if he looked over the edge of quite a little cliff, and he had never liked ladders, let alone trees, never having to escape from wolves before. So you can imagine how his head swam now when he looked down between his dangling toes and saw the dark lands opening wide underneath him, touched here and there with the light of the moon on a hillside rock or a stream in the plains. The pale peaks of the mountains were coming nearer, moonlit spikes of rock sticking out of the black shadows. Summer or not, it seemed very cold. He shut his eyes and wondered if he could hold on any longer. Then he imagined what would happen if he did not. He felt sick. The flight ended only just in time for him, just before his arms gave way. He loosed Dory's ankles with a gasp and fell into the rough platform of an eagle's eyrie. There he lay without speaking, and his thoughts were a mixture of surprise at being saved from the fire, and fear lest he fall off that narrow place into the deep shadows on either side. He was feeling very queer indeed in his head by this time, after the dreadful adventures of the last 3 days, with next to nothing to eat, and he found himself saying aloud, now I know what a piece of bacon feels when it is suddenly picked out of the pan on a fork and put back on the shelf. No, you don't, he heard Dory answering, because the bacon knows that it will get back in the pan sooner or later, and it is to be hoped we shan't. Also, eagles aren't forks. Oh, no, not a bit like storks. Forks, I mean, said Bilbo, sitting up and looking anxiously at the eagle who was sitting up and looking Sitting up and looking anxiously at the eagle who was perched close by. He wondered what other nonsense he had been saying, and if the eagle would think it rude. You ought not to be rude to an eagle when you're only the size of a hobbit, and are up in his eyrie at night. The eagle only sharpened its beak on a stone, and trimmed its feathers, and took no notice. Soon another eagle flew up. The Lord of the Eagles bids you to bring your prisoners to the great shelf, he cried, and was off again. The other seized Dory in his claws, and flew away with him into the night, leaving Bilbo all alone. He had just strength to wonder what the messenger had meant by prisoners, and began to think of being torn up for supper like a rabbit, when his own turn came. The eagle came back, seized him by his talons, by the back of his coat, and swooped off. This time he flew only a short way. Very soon Bilbo was laid down, trembling with fear, on a wide shelf of rock on the mountainside. There was no path down on it to save by flying, and no path down off it except by jumping over a precipice. There he had found all the others, sitting with their backs to the mountain wall. The Lord of the Eagles was also there, and was speaking to Gandalf. It seemed that Bilbo was not going to be eaten after all. The wizard and the Eagle Lord appeared to know each other slightly, and even to be on friendly terms. As a matter of fact, Gandalf, who had often been in the mountains, had once rendered a service to the Eagles, and healed their lord from an arrow wound. So you see, prisoners had meant prisoners rescued from the goblins only, and not captives of the Eagles. As Bilbo listened to the talk of Gandalf, he realized at last that they were going to escape really and truly from the dreadful mountains. He was discussing plans with the great eagle for carrying the dwarves and himself and Bilbo far away, and setting them down well on their journey across the plains below. The Lord of the Eagles would not take them anywhere near where men live. They would shoot at us with their great bows of yew, he said, for they would think we were after their sheep. And at other times they would be right. No, we are glad to cheat the goblins of their sport, and glad to repay our thanks to you, but we will not risk ourselves for dwarves in the southward plains. Very well, said Gandalf. Take us where and as far as you will. We are already deeply obliged to you, but in the meantime we are famished with hunger. I'm nearly dead of it, said Bilbo in a weak little voice that nobody heard. That perhaps can be mended, said the Lord of the Eagles. Later on you might have seen a bright fire on the shelf of rock, and figures of the dwarves around it cooking and making a fine roasting smell. The eagles had brought up dry boughs for fuel, and they had brought rabbits, hares, and a small sheep. The dwarves managed all the preparations. Bilbo was too weak to help, and anyway he was not much good at skinning rabbits or cutting up meat, being used to having it delivered by the butcher, all ready to cook. Gandalf, too, was lying down after doing his part in setting the fire going, since Oin and Gloin had lost their tinder boxes. Dwarves have never taken to matches even yet. So ended the adventures of the Misty Mountains. Soon Bilbo's stomach was feeling full and comfortable again, and he felt he could sleep contentedly, though really he would have liked a loaf and butter better than bits of meat toasted on sticks. He slept curled up on the hard rock more soundly than he had done in his feather bed in his own hole at home. But all night he dreamed of his own house, and wandered in his sleep in all the different rooms, looking for something that he could not find or remember what it looked like. All right, so that ends that chapter there. We're going to put some bacon in the pan. Yeah, the song that the goblins sang, it could have been a black metal song, you're right. So what's there to talk about here? There's a few things. There is a drawing here that made by Tolkien, the Misty Mountains looking west from the Eyrie towards the Goblin Gate. We're going to hold that up so you can see it there. There we go. That is one of Tolkien's drawings. He did very pastoral views and was very good at drawing mountains and trees and rivers. Not so great at drawing people, but that's okay. He didn't often draw people. Yeah, there's a few minor things to mention here. There is sort of it mentions that Bilbo is sort of a spoiled aristocrat. He doesn't know how to skin rabbits. He doesn't really know how to prepare meat. He gets all his food from the butcher. Compare that to Samwise, who expertly skinned and cooked rabbits stew in The Lord of the Rings. So it's sort of showing that, Bilbo's a bit of a spoiled aristocrat here. There was something else I wanted to mention. What was it? I guess not. I don't remember what it was. I'm sort of glazing over this. I think we have enough time for Chapter 7, which is called Queer Lodgings. And this is it super long? Let's see, how long is this one? That's quite a long chapter, actually. We'll get through it. We'll do it quickly. So Chapter 7, Queer Lodging. This is where we're introduced to Beorn. The next morning, Bilbo woke up with the early sun in his eyes. He jumped up to look at what time, and to go to put his kettle on, and found he was not home at all. So he sat down and wished in vain for a wash and a brush. He did not get either, nor tea, nor toast, nor bacon for his breakfast, only cold mutton and rabbit. After all that, he had to get ready for a fresh start. Thank you for the follow. He did not get either... Oh, I read about that part, sorry. This time he was allowed to climb up on to an eagle's back and cling between his wings. The air rushed over him, and he shut his eyes. The dwarves were crying farewells and promising to repay the Lord of the Eagles if they ever could, as off rose 15 great birds from the mountain's side. The sun was still close to the eastern edge of things. The morning was cool, and mists were in valleys and hollows and twined here and there about the peaks and pinnacles of the hill. Bilbo opened up an eye to peep and saw that the birds were already high up in the world far away, and the mountains were falling back behind them into the distance. He shut his eyes again and held on tighter. "Don't pinch," said his eagle. "You need not be frightened like a rabbit, even if you look rather like one. It is a fair morning with little wind. What is finer than flying?" Bilbo would have liked to say a warm bath and late breakfast on the lawn afterwards, but he thought it better to say nothing at all, and to let his clutch up just a tiny bit. After a good while, the eagles must have seen the point they were making for, even from their great height, for they began to go down circling round in great spirals. They did this for a long while, and at last the hobbit opened his eyes again. The earth was much nearer, and below them were trees that looked like oaks and elms, and wide grass lands, and a river running through it all. But cropping out of the ground, right in the path of the stream, which looped itself about it, was a great rock, almost a hill of stone, like a last outpost of the distant mountains, or a large piece cast miles into the plain by some giant among giants. Quickly now to the top of this rock the eagles swooped, and one by one set down their passengers. "Farewell," they cried. "Wherever you fare, till your eyries receive you at your journey's end." That is the polite thing to say among eagles. "May the wind under your wings bear you where your sun sails and the moon walks," answered Gandalf, who knew the correct reply. And so they parted. And though the Lord of the Eagles became in after days the king of all birds and wore a golden crown, and his 15 chieftains golden collars, made of the gold that the dwarves gave him, Bilbo never saw them again, except high and far off in the battle of 5 armies. But as that comes at the end of this tale, we will say no more about it just now. There was a flat space at the top of this hill of stone and well-worn path, and with many steps leading down it to the river, across which a ford of huge flat stones led to the grassland beyond the stream. There was a little cave, a wholesome one with a pebbly floor, at the foot of the steps near the end of the stony ford. Here the party gathered and discussed what is to be done. "I always meant to see you all safe, if possible, over the mountains," said the wizard. "And now, by good management and good luck, I have done it. Indeed, we are now a good deal further east than I ever meant to come with you, for after all this is not my adventure. I may look in again on it before it is all over, but in the meanwhile I have some other pressing business to attend to." The dwarves groaned and looked most distressed, and Bilbo wept. They had begun to think Gandalf was going to come all the way, and would always be there to help them out of difficulties. "I'm not going to disappear this very instant," said he. "I can give you a day or 2 more. Perhaps I can help you out of your present plight, and I need a little help myself. We have no food and no baggage and no ponies to ride, and you don't know where you are. Now I can tell you that. You are still some miles north of the path which we should have been following. If we had not left the mountain pass in a hurry. Very few people live in these parts, unless they have come here since I was last down this way, which is some years ago. But there is a somebody that I know of who lives not far away. That somebody made the steps on the giant rock, the Carrack, I believe he calls it. He does not come here often, certainly not in the daytime, and it is no good waiting for him. In fact, it would be very dangerous. We must go and find him, and if all goes well at our meeting, I think I shall be off, and wish you all, like the eagles, farewell wherever you fare." They begged him not to leave them. They offered him dragon gold and silver and jewels, but he would not change his mind. We shall see," he said. "And I think I have earned already some of your dragon gold, when you have got it." After that they stopped pleading. Then they took off their clothes and bathed in the river, which was shallow and clear and stony at the ford. When they had dried in the sun, which was now strong and warm, they were refreshed, if still sore and a bit hungry. Soon they crossed the ford, carrying the hobbit, and began to march through the long green grass and down the lines of the wide-armed oaks and the tall elms. "And why is it called the Carrack?" asked Bilbo as he went along at the wizard's side. "He called it the Carrack because Carrack is his word for it. He calls things like that Carracks, and this one is the Carrack, because it is the only one near his home, and he knows it well." "Who calls it? Who knows it?" "The somebody I spoke of, a very great person. You must all be very polite when I introduce you. I shall introduce you slowly, 2 by 2, I think, and you must be careful not to annoy him, or heaven knows what will happen. He can be appalling when he is angry, though he is kind enough if humoured, Still, I warn you, he gets angry easily." The dwarves all gathered round when they heard the wizard talking like this to Bilbo. Is that person you are talking to us now?" Wait, try that again. I need to drink some water here. I'm stuttering a lot. Here we go. "Is that the person you are taking us to now?" they said. "Couldn't you find somebody more easy-tempered? Hadn't you better explain it all a bit clearer?" and so on. "Yes, it certainly is. No, I could not. I was explaining very carefully," answered the wizard crossly. "If you must know, his name is Bjorn. He's very strong, and he's a skin changer." "What? A furrier? A man that calls rabbits conies when he doesn't turn their skins into squirrels?" asked Bilbo. "Good gracious heavens, no," said Gandalf. "Don't be a fool, Mr. Baggins, if you can help it. And in the name of all wonder, don't mention the word furrier again as long as you're within a couple of 100 miles of his house. Nor rug, cake, tippet, muff, nor any other unfortunate word. He's a skin changer. He changes his skin. Sometimes he is a huge black bear, sometimes he is a great, strong, black-haired man, with huge arms and a great beard. I cannot tell you much more, though that ought to be enough. Some say that he's a bear descended from the great and ancient bears of the mountains, that lived before the giants came. Others say that he is a man descended from the first men who lived before Smaug or the other dragons came into this part of the world, and before the goblins came into the hills out of the north. I cannot say, though I fancy the last is the true tale. He is not the sort of person to ask questions of. At any rate, he is under no enchantment but his own. He lives in an oak wood, and he has a great wooden house, and as a man he keeps cattle and horses, which are nearly as marvelous as himself. They work for him and talk to him. He does not eat them. Neither does he go to hunt or eat wild animals. He keeps hives and hives of great fierce bees, and lives mostly on cream and honey. As a bear, he ranges far and wide. I once saw him sitting all alone on the top of the Carrack at night, watching the moon sinking towards the misty mountains, and I heard him growl in the tongue of bears. The day will come when they will perish, and I shall go back. That is what I believe. He once came from the mountains himself." Thank you for this Prime sub. Flock off Feather Face. Thank you for the subscription. Can we get a little celebration in the chat for a new subscriber? Thank you very much for that. That is fantastic. Flock off Feather Face. Isn't that a line from a movie? I was going to pause here. That alert scared the bejesus out of me, but I was going to pause here. Thank you so much for the subscription. Welcome in. My name is John Sierra, also known as NecroVMX. I stream every day. I usually do gaming content, but I also do content related to J.R.R. Tolkien, which is why you caught me here doing an analytical reading of The Hobbit. So, interesting passages here. The thing about Bjorn that I find most interesting is that Gandalf wonders, is Bjorn a man that can take the shape of a bear, or is he a bear that can take the shape of a man? He's hold both things. He assumes that he's a man that takes the shape of a bear, and Gandalf's actually correct. Bjorn is a man, not a bear. And we learned this from Tolkien's letters, actually. We learned it from the letters where he did state that Bjorn was, in fact, a mortal man. He was not a bear. We don't know a lot about skin changers. The other thing I wanted to mention is there was an anecdote that came from Tumblr. There is a very large Tolkien following on Tumblr, and it was mentioned the Tolkien Society. Well, thank you so much, Flock. Thank you so much. I'm glad to have you here. The Tolkien Society had a ridiculous argument that lasted like 6 hours long, according to the person there, that was arguing about whether or not there were bees in Middle-earth. If you read The Hobbit, you know there's bees in Middle-earth. Gandalf just said that this guy raises bees. Bilbo wrote a poem called Errantry that was about a knight that fought giant bees called Dumbledores. Dumbledore is an old English word that means bumblebee. But there was other references. Meduseld, the golden hall of Rohan, where Theoden King lives. Meduseld translates to mead hall. Mead is a liqueur made from honey. They also drank a white mead in Lothlorien. So of course there's bees. The fact that they could argue about it for 6 hours, and the fact is that nobody brought up the Hobbit at all. Nobody brought up Bjorn. Nobody brought up the bees in this story. They came at it from the Meduseld thing. So it was an example of you might have either read it, Alice, or you heard it on List Critics, because it came up on the List Critics podcast. But it is an example of some Tolkien scholars going for the most complex explanation instead of the easiest and simplest explanation, which I find to be very amusing. Very, very amusing. We're going to continue here. Bilbo and the dwarves now had plenty to think about, and they asked no more questions. They still had a long way to walk before them. Up slope and down dale they plodded. It grew very hot. Sometimes they rested under the trees, and then Bilbo felt so hungry that he would have eaten acorns if any had been ripe enough yet to have fallen to the ground. It was the middle of the afternoon before they noticed that great patches of flowers had begun to spring up, all the same kinds growing together as if they had been planted. Especially there was clover, waving patches of coxcomb clover, and purple clover, and wide stretches of short, white, sweet, honey-smelling clover. There was a buzzing and a whirring and a droning in the air. Bees were busy everywhere, and such bees Bilbo had never seen anything like them. If one was to sting me, he thought, I should swell up as big as I am. They were bigger than hornets. The drones were bigger than your thumb, a good deal, and the bands of yellow on their deep black bodies shone like fiery gold, or like our mascot, right? The channel's mascot. We are getting near, said Gandalf. We are on the edge of the bee pastures. After a while they came to a belt of tall and very ancient oaks, and beyond these to a high thorn hedge through which you could neither see nor scramble. You had better wait here, said the wizard to the dwarves, and I will call or whistle to come after me, and you will see the way I go, but only in pairs, mind, about 5 minutes between each pair of you. Bomber is fattest, and will do for 2. You'd better come alone and last. Come on, Mr. Baggins. There is a gate somewhere round this way. And with that he went off along the hedge, taking the frightened hobbit with him. They soon came to a wooden gate, high and broad, beyond which they would see gardens and a cluster of low wooden buildings, some thatched and made of unshaped logs, barns, stables, sheds, and a long, low wooden house. Inside, on the southward side of the great hedge, were rows and rows of hives with bell-shaped tops made of straw. The noise of the giant bees flying to and fro and crawling in and out filled the air. The wizard and the hobbit pushed open the heavy creaking gate, and went down a wide track toward the house. Some horses, very sleek and well-groomed, trotted up across the grass and looked at them intently with very intelligent faces, and off they galloped to the buildings. They have gone to tell him of the arrival of strangers, said Gandalf. I want to pause here just to answer the chat here. You're right, Flock, you're right. They think if they can only refer to the letters or only refer to the Silmarillion or stoop so low as to make a reference to the Lord of the Rings that it makes them smarter. And the answer was right here in The Hobbit. You know, it's just crazy. The simplest explanation is often the truest one, which is not exactly Occam's razor, but it's a close approximation of it. I wanted to mention here something that was said. Let's see. Oh, not something that was said, but a thought that I had. If you've ever played the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, there are some buildings in it, particularly the mead halls of the Nordic tribes there. And the one that really comes to mind is Jorvaskir, which is in Whiterun. And Jorvaskir, whenever I enter Jorvaskir, I always think of it as being Bjorn's house. The description of it is very, very close to what Jorvaskir was. So if you ever joined the companions in Skyrim, that's what I imagine Bjorn's house as being like, with the long table and it being sort of low and all made out of wood, but very nice on the inside, you know. Soon they reached a courtyard, 3 walls of which were formed by the wooden house and its 2 long wings. In the middle there was lying a great oak trunk with many lopped branches beside it. Standing near was a huge man with a thick black beard and hair, and great bare arms and legs with knotted muscles. He was clothed in a tunic of wool down to his knees, and was leaning on a large axe. The horses were standing by him with their noses at his shoulder.
Here they are, he said to the horses. They don't look dangerous. You can be off.
They laughed a great rolling laugh, put down his axe, and came forward.
Who are you and what do you want?
He asked gruffly, standing in front of them and towering tall above Gandalf. As for Bilbo, he could easily have trotted through his legs without ducking his head to miss the fringe of the man's brown tunic.
I am Gandalf, said the wizard. Never heard of him, growled the man. And what is this little fellow? He said, stooping down to frown at the hobbit with his bushy black eyebrows. That is Mr. Baggins, a hobbit of good family and unimpeachable reputation, said Gandalf. Bilbo bowed. He had no hat to take off and was painfully conscious of his many missing buttons. I am a wizard, continued Gandalf. I have heard of you if you've not heard of me, but perhaps you have heard of my good cousin Radagast, who lives near the southern borders of Mirkwood. Yes, not a bad fellow as wizards go, I believe. I used to see him now and again, said Beorn. Well, now I know who you are and what you say you are. What do you want? To tell the truth, we have lost our luggage and nearly lost our way, and are rather in need of help, or at least of advice. I may say we have rather had a bad time with goblins in the mountains. Goblins, said the big man less gruffly. Oh, so you've been having trouble with them, have you? What did you go near them for? We did not mean to. They surprised us at night in a pass which we had to cross. We were coming out of the lands of the west into the countries. It's a long tale. Then you better come inside and tell me some of it, if it won't take all day, said the man, leading the way through a dark door that opened out of the courtyard into his house. Following him, they found themselves in a wide hall with a fireplace in the middle. Though it was summer, there was a wood fire burning, and the smoke was rising to the blackened rafters in search of the way out through the opening in the roof. They passed through this dim hall, lit only by the fire and the hole above it, and came through another smaller door in a sort of veranda, propped up on wooden posts made of single tree trunks. It faced south and was still warm and filled with the light of the westering sun which slanted into it, and fell golden on the garden full of flowers that came right up to the steps. Here they sat on wooden benches while Gandalf began his tale, and Bilbo swung his dangling legs and looked at the flowers in the garden, wondering what their names could be, as he had never seen half of them before. And here, I'm actually going to pause here and show you there is actually a drawing that Tolkien included of Beorn's Hall, which you can see there. And like I said, if you've ever played Skyrim, it really does look like Jorrvaskr, or Jorrvaskr looks like this. A bit more elongated. But I think that drawing in here is why I always think of it with the fire pit and with the long table and the wooden posts and the shape of the roof and everything makes me think of Jorrvaskr. I was coming over the mountains with a friend or two, said the wizard. Or two? I can only see one, and a little one at that, said Beorn. Well, to tell you the truth, I did not like to bother you with a lot of us until I found out if you were busy. I will give a call if I may. Go on, call away. So Gandalf gave a long, shrill whistle, and presently Thorin and Dori came round the house by the garden path, and stood bowing low before them. 1 or 3, you meant, I see, said Beorn. But these aren't hobbits, they're dwarves. Thorin Oakenshield at your service. Dori at your service, said the 2 dwarves, bowing again. I don't need your service, thank you, said Beorn. But I expect you need mine. I am not over fond of dwarves, but if it is true you are Thorin, son of Thrain, son of Thror, I believe, then, and that your companion is respectable, and that your enemies of goblins, and are not up to any mischief in my lands. What are you up to, by the way? They are on their way to visit the land of their fathers, away east beyond Mirkwood, put in Gandalf. And it is entirely accident that we are put in your lands at all. We were crossing by the high pass that should have brought us to the road that lies to the south of your country, when we were attacked by evil goblins, as I was about to tell you. Go on telling that, said Beorn, who was never very polite. There was a terrible storm. The stone giants were out hurling rocks, and at the head of the pass we took refuge in a cave, the Hobbit and I, and several of our companions. Do you call 2 several? Well, no, as a matter of fact, there were more than 2. Where are they? Killed, eaten, gone home? Well, no, they don't seem to have all come when I whistled. Shy, I expect. You see, we're very much afraid that we're rather a lot for you to entertain. Go on, whistle again. I'm in for a party, it seems, and 1 or 2 more won't make much difference, growled Beorn.
Gandalf whistled again, but Nori and Ori were there almost before he had stopped, for if you remember, Gandalf had told them to come in pairs every 5 minutes. "Hello," said Bjorn.
"Hello," said Bjorn. "You came pretty quick. Where are you hiding?" "Come on my jack-in-the-boxes."
"Nori at your service. Ori at—" they began, but Bjorn interrupted them.
"Thank you. When I want your help, I'll ask for it. Sit down and let us get on with this tale, or it'll be supper time before it is ended."
"As soon as we were asleep," went on Gandalf, "a crack at the back of the cave opened. Goblins came out and grabbed the hobbit and the dwarves and our troop of ponies."
"Troop of ponies? What were you, a traveling circus? Or were you carrying lots of goods? Or do you call this 6 a troop?"
"Oh, no. As a matter of fact, there were more than 6 ponies, for there were more than 6 of us. And well, here are 2 more." Just at that moment, Balin and Dwalin appeared and bowed so low that their beards swept the stone floor. The big man was frowning at first, but they did their very best to be frightfully polite, and kept on nodding and bending and bowing and waving their hoods before their knees in proper dwarf fashion, till he stopped frowning and burst into a chuckling laugh. They looked so comical.
"Troop is right," he said.
"A fine comic one. Come on, my merry men. What are your names? I don't want your service just now, only your names.
Then sit down and stop wagging."
"Balin and Dwalin," they said, not daring to be offended, and they sat flop on the floor looking rather surprised.
"Now go on again," said Bjorn to the wizard. "Where was I? Oh, yes, I was not grabbed. I killed a goblin or 2 with a flash."
"Good," growled Bjorn.
"It is some good, being a wizard, then."
"And slipped inside the crack before it closed. I followed down into the main hall, which was crowded with goblins. The great goblin was there with 30 or 40 armed guards. I thought to myself, even if they were not all chained together, what can a dozen do against so many?"
"A dozen? That's the first time I've heard 8 called a dozen. Or have you still got more jacks that haven't yet come out of their boxes?"
"Well, yes, there seem to be a couple more here now. Fili and Kili, I believe," said Gandalf, as the 2 now appeared and stood smiling and bowing.
"That's enough," said Bjorn. "Sit down and be quiet. Now go on, Gandalf."
So Gandalf went on with the tale until he came to the fight in the dark, the discovery of the lower gate, and their horror when they found that Mr. Baggins had been mislaid. "We counted ourselves and found there was no hobbit. There were only 14 of us left."
14? That's the first time I've heard 1 from 10 leave 14. You mean 9, or else you haven't told me all the names of your party.
"Well, of course you haven't seen Oin and Gloin yet. And bless me, here they are. Hope you'll forgive them for bothering you."
"Oh, let 'em all come. Hurry up. Come along, you 2, and sit down. But look here, Gandalf. Even now we've only got yourself 10 dwarves and the hobbit that was lost. That only makes 11 plus 1 mislaid and not 14 unless wizards count differently to other people. But now please get on with the tale."
Bjorn did not show it more than he could help, but really had begun to get very interested. You see, in the old days he had known the very part of the mountains that Gandalf was describing. He nodded and he growled, and when he heard of the hobbits' reappearance and of their scramble down the stone slide and of the wolf ring in the woods. When Gandalf came to their climbing into trees with the wolves all underneath, he got up and strode about and muttered,
"I wish I'd been there. I would have given them more than fireworks."
"Well," said Gandalf, very glad to see his tale was making a good impression, "I did the best I could. There we were with the wolves going mad underneath us and the forest beginning to blaze in places, and the goblins came down from the hills and discovered us. They yelled with delight and sang songs making fun of us. 15 birds and 5 fir trees."
"Good heavens," growled Bjorn. "Don't pretend goblins can't count. They can. 12 isn't 15, and they know it."
"And so do I. There were Bifur and Bofur as well. I haven't ventured to introduce them before, but here they are." In came Bifur and Bofur. "And me," gasped Bomber, puffing up behind. He was fat and also angry at being left to last. He'd refused to wait 5 minutes and followed immediately after the other 2. So, yeah, let's stop here. Jack in the Box is an odd turn of phrase, absolutely. And, there are many odd turns of phrases in The Hobbit. We talked earlier about Christmas tree. And there are a few other instances like that where we can say that this is the way that Tolkien told the story so that his children would understand what he was talking about. They would understand what a Christmas tree looks like. They would understand what a Jack in the Box actually is. And we even get like these origins of things like the origin of the term golf, origin of the term out of the frying pan into the fire. Going by the author's conceit that this is the past and that the Red Book of Westmarch was brought out of the Undying Lands to England by an elf named Elfwine. and then translated by Tolkien, we can see, especially in The Hobbit, that we see a lot of editorializing and a lot of... I have actually seen Jack in the Boxes in person as a child. Editorializing and a lot of alterations to the text, especially in choosing names of hobbits. And that's how we get names like Samwise, for example, or even Frodo. Frodo's name was actually Maura, and that was the name in Westron. And Tolkien found, the fictional version of J.R.R. Tolkien found that translating it to Maura, it seems like a very feminine name, so he had initially translated it to Froda, which became Frodo. So you do get these very odd turns of phrases, especially in The Hobbit, and you could chalk it up to Tolkien's translation, or you could chalk it up to the way that Bilbo's telling the story, or just the really the out-of-universe example of Tolkien telling the story and explaining things to his children. We do find many, many connections to other works, especially the Silmarillion here, but it was written as a standalone tale. They never mention certain things. The Hobbit it takes place in Middle-earth. The term Middle-earth does not appear in the book. The Shire is a term that doesn't appear here. It's very prototypical. So we get these odd turns of phrases like Jack in the Box, like Christmas tree, like golf. Yeah. All right, let's continue here. Well, now there are 15 of you, and since goblins can count, I suppose that is all there were up in the trees. Now, perhaps we can finish the story without any more interruptions. Mr. Baggins saw then how clever Gandalf had been. The interruptions had really made Bjorn more interested in the story, and the story had kept him from sending the dwarves off at once like suspicious beggars. He never invited people into his house if he could help it. He had very few friends, and they lived a good way away, and he never invited more than a couple of these to his house at a time. Now he had got 15 strangers sitting on the porch, and I have to pause here again and mention that this is the same technique that Gandalf used on Bilbo. If all 13 dwarves showed up at his house, he would have opened it up and said, "Goodbye," and slammed the door. But he sent a few at a time. And it's the same exact thing that had happened to Bilbo. So this is a trick that Gandalf seems very fond of. By the time the wizard had finished his tale and had told of the eagle's rescue and how they had all been brought to the Carrack, the sun had fallen behind the peaks of the misty mountains, and the shadows were long in Beorn's garden. "A very good tale," said he. "The best I've heard for a long while. If all beggars could tell such a good one, they might find me kinder. You may be making it all up, of course, but you deserve a supper for the story all the same. Let's have something to eat." "Yes, please," they all said together. "Thank you very much." Inside the hall it was now quite dark. Bjorn clapped his hands, and in trotted 4 beautiful white ponies and several large, long-bodied grey dogs. Bjorn said something to them in a queer language, like animal noises, and turned to talk. They wound out again, and soon came back carrying torches in their mouths, which they lit at the fire and stuck in low brackets on the pillars of the hall, about the central hearth. The dogs could stand on their hind legs when they wished, and carry things with their forefeet. Quickly they got out boards and trestles from the side walls and set them up near the fire. Then "baa, baa, baa" was heard, and in came snow-white sheep led by a large coal-black ram. One bore on a white cloth embroidered at the edges with figures of animals. Others bore on the broad backs trays with bowls and platters and knives and wooden spoons, which the dogs took and quickly laid on the trestle tables. These were very low enough even for Bilbo to sit at comfortably. Beside them was a pony, pushed 2 low-seated benches with wide rush bottoms and a little short, thick legs for Gandalf and Thorin, while at the far end he put Bjorn's big black chair of the same sort, in which he had sat with his great legs stuck far out under the table. These were all the chairs he had in his hall, and he probably had them low like the tables for the convenience of the wonderful animals that waited on him. What did the rest sit on? They were not forgotten. The other ponies came in rolling round drum-shaped sections of logs, smoothed and polished, and low enough even for Bilbo. So soon they were all seated at Bjorn's table, and the hall had not seen such a gathering for many a year. There they had supper or a dinner, such as they had never had since they left the last homely house of the west and said goodbye to Elrond. The light of the torches and the fire flickered about them, and on the table were 2 tall red beeswax candles. All at the time they ate, Bjorn in his deep rolling voice told tales of the wild lands on this side of the mountains, and especially of the dark and dangerous wood that lay outstretched far to the north and south a day's ride before them, barring their way to the east, a terrible forest of Mirkwood. The dwarves listened and shook their beards, for they knew that they must soon venture into that forest, and after the mountains it was the worst of the perils that they had to pass before they came to the dragon's stronghold. When dinner was over, they began to tell tales of their own, but Bjorn seemed to be growing drowsy and paid little heed to them. They spoke mostly of gold and silver and jewels and the makings of things by smithcraft, and Bjorn did not appear to care for such things. There were no such things of gold or silver in his hall, and few save the knives were made of metal at all. They sat long at the table with their wooden drinking bowls filled with mead. The dark night came on outside. The fires in the middle of the hall were built with fresh logs, and the torches were put out, and still they sat in the light of the dancing flames, with the pillars of the house standing tall behind them, and dark at the top like trees of the forest. Whether it was magic or not, it seemed that Bilbo heard a sound like wind in the branches, stirring up in the rafters, and the hoot of owls. Soon he began to nod with sleep, and the voices seemed to grow far away until he woke with a start. The great door had creaked and slammed. Bjorn was gone. The dwarves were sitting cross-legged on the floor round the fire, and presently they began to sing. Some of the verses were like this, but there were many more, and their singing went on for a long while. The wind was in the withered heath, but in the forest stirred no leaf. There shadows lay by night and day, and dark things silent crept beneath. The wind came down from mountains cold, and like a tide it roared and rolled. The branches groaned, the forest moaned, and leaves were laid upon the mould. The wind went on from west to east, all movement in the forest ceased, but shrill and harsh across the marsh its whistling voices were released. The grasses hissed, their tassels bent, the reeds were rattling, on it went, o'er shaking pool in heaven's cool, where racing clouds were torn and rent. It passed the lonely mountain bare, and swept over the dragon's lair. There black and dark lay boulders stark, and flying smoke was in the air. It left the world and took its flight. Over the wide seas of the night, the moon set sail upon the gale, and stars were fanned to leaping light. Bjorn's meal getting compared to Elrond's is indeed high praise. Of course, when you think about it, they had had so little of good food in so long that I think anything that was hot and prepared well, I think they would have said that, you know. Or which is what you said in your second message. I was replying to the first one. Bilbo began to nod again. Suddenly up stood Gandalf. "It's time for us to sleep," he said. "For us, but not, I think, for Bjorn. In this hall we can rest sound and safe, but I warn you not to forget what Bjorn said before he left us. You must not stray outside until the sun is up, on your peril." Bilbo found that beds had already been laid at the side of the hall, on a sort of raised platform between the pillars and the outer wall. For him there was a little mattress of straw and woolen blankets. He snuggled into them very gladly, summertime though it was. The fire burned low, and he fell asleep. Yet in the night he woke. The fire had now sunk to a few embers, and the dwarves and Gandalf were all asleep, to judge by their breathing. A splash of white on the floor came in from the high moon, which was peering out through the smoke hole of the roof. There was a growling sound outside, and a noise as of some great animal scuffling at the door. Bilbo wondered what it was, and whether it could be Bjorn in enchanted shape, and if he would come in as a bear and kill them. He dived under the blankets and hid his head, and fell asleep again, at last, in spite of his fears. Alice, could you take care of that, please? It was full morning when he awoke. One of the dwarves had fallen over him in the shadows where he lay, and had rolled down with a bump from the platforms on the floor. It was Beaufort, and he was grumbling about it when Bilbo opened his eyes. "Get up, lazy bones," he said, "or there'll be no breakfast left for you." Up jumped Bilbo. "Breakfast!" he cried. "Where is breakfast?" "Mostly inside us," answered the other dwarves, who were moving about the hall. "But what is left is out on the veranda. We have been about looking for Bjorn ever since the sun got up, but there was no sign of him anywhere, though we found breakfast laid out as soon as we went out." "Where is Gandalf?" said Bilbo, moving off to find something to eat as quick as he could. "Oh, out and about somewhere," they told him. But he saw no sign of the wizard all day until the evening. Just before sunset he walked into the hall, where the hobbits and the dwarves were having supper, waited on by Bjorn's wonderful animals, as they had been all day. Of Bjorn they had seen and heard nothing since the night before, and they were getting puzzled. "Where is our host, and where have you been all day yourself?" they all cried. "One question at a time, and none till after supper. I haven't had a bite since breakfast." At last Gandalf pushed away his plate and jug. He had eaten 2 whole loaves, with masses of butter and honey and clotted cream, and drunk at least a quart of mead, and he took out his pipe. "I will answer the second question first," he said. "Bless me, this is a splendid place for smoke rings." Indeed, for a long time they could get nothing more out of him. He was so busy sending smoke rings, dodging about the pillars of the hall, changing them into all sorts of different shapes and colors, and setting them at last chasing one another out of the hole of the roof. They must have looked very queer from the outside, popping out of the air one after another, green, blue, red, silver gray, yellow, white, big ones little ones dodging through the big ones and joining into figure eights and going off like a flock of birds into the distance. "I have been out picking bear tracks," he said at last. "There must have been a regular bears' meeting outside here last night. I soon saw that Bjorn could not have made them all. There were far too many of them, and they were of various sizes, too. I should say there were little bears, large bears, ordinary bears, and gigantic big bears, all dancing outside from dark to nearly dawn. They came from almost every direction, except from the west over the river, from the mountains. In that direction only one set of footprints led. None coming, but only going away from here. I followed them as far as the Carrack. There they disappeared into the river, but the water was too deep and strong beyond the rock for me to cross. It is easy enough, as you remember, to get from this bank to the Carrack by the ford, but on the other side is a cliff standing up from a swirling channel. I had to walk miles before I found a place where the river was wide and shallow enough for me to wade and swim, and then miles back again to pick up the tracks again. By that time it was too late for me to follow them far. They went straight off in the direction of the pine woods on the east side of the Misty Mountains, where we had our pleasant little party with the wargs the night before last. And now I think I've answered your first question, too," ended Gandalf. And he sat a long while silent. Bilbo thought he knew what the wizard meant. "What shall we do?" he cried. "If he leads all the wargs and goblins down here, we shall all be caught and killed. I thought you said he was not a friend of theirs." "So I did, and don't be silly. You'd better go to bed. Your wits are sleepy." The hobbit felt quite crushed, as there seemed to be nothing else to do but go to bed, and while the dwarves were still singing songs, he dropped asleep, still puzzling his little head about Bjorn, till he dreamed a dream of hundreds of black bears dancing slow, heavy dances round and round the moonlight in the courtyard. Then he woke up when everyone else was asleep, and he heard the same scraping, scuffing, snuffling, and growling as before. Next morning they were all wakened by Bjorn himself. "So here you're all still," he said. He picked up the hobbit and laughed. "Not eaten up by wargs or goblins or wicked bears yet, I see." And he poked Mr. Baggins's waistcoat most disrespectfully. "Little bunny's getting nice and fat again on bread and honey," he chuckled. "Come and have some more." So they all went to breakfast with him. Bjorn was most jolly for a change. Indeed, he seemed to be in splendidly good humor and set them all laughing with his funny stories. Nor did they have to wonder long where he had been or why he was so nice to them, for he told them himself. He had been over the river and right back up into the mountains, from which you can guess that he could travel quickly, in bare shape at any rate. From the burnt wolf glade he had soon found out part of their story was true, but he had found more than that. He had caught a warg and a goblin wandering in the woods. From these he got news. The goblin patrols were still hunting with wargs for the dwarves, and they were fiercely angry because of the death of the great goblin, and also because of the burning of the chief wolf's nose, and the death from the wizard's fire of many of his chief servants. So much they told him when he forced them, but he guessed there was still more wickedness than this afoot, and that a great raid of the whole goblin army with the wolf allies into the land shadowed by the mountains might soon be made to find the dwarves, or to take vengeance on the men and creatures that lived there, and who they thought must be sheltering them. "It was a good story, that of yours," said Bjorn, "but I like it still better now that I'm sure it's true. You must forgive me not taking your word. If you had lived near the edge of Mirkwood, you would take the word of no one that you did not know as well as your brother or better. As it is, I can only say that I have hurried home as fast as I could to tell you to see that you are safe, and to offer you help that I can. I shall think more kindly of dwarves after this. Killed the great goblin, killed the great goblin," he chuckled fiercely to himself. "What did you do to the goblin and the warg?" asked Bilbo suddenly. "Come and see," said Bjorn. And they followed round the house. A goblin's head was stuck outside the gate, and a warg skin was nailed to a tree just beyond. Bjorn was a fierce enemy, but now he was their friend, and Gandalf thought it wise to tell him their whole story and the reason of their journey, so they can get help, the most help that he could offer. Yeah, he seems like a very, very capable man. He also seems very old. We know that he's passed on as of the Lord of the Rings. Um, I mean, even the fact that his son at that point was called Grimbeorn the Old. So, Bjorn right now doesn't even seem to be married, doesn't seem to have any children, he doesn't even have any friends. But the bearers that came to him and danced there may have been the first of the Bjornings. This is what he promised to do for them. He would provide ponies for each of them and a horse for Gandalf for their journey to the forest, and he would lade them with food to last them for weeks with care, and packed so as to be easy as possible to carry, nuts, flour, sealed jars of dried fruits, and red earthenware pots of honey, and twice-baked cakes that would keep a long time, and on a little of which they could march far. The making of these was one of his secrets, but honey was in them, as in most of his foods, and they were good to eat, though they made one thirsty. Water, he said, they would not need to carry this side of the forest, for there were streams and springs along the road. But your way through Mirkwood is dark, dangerous, and difficult, he said. Water is not easy to find there, nor food. The time is not yet come for nuts, though it may be past and gone indeed before you get to the other side. The nuts are about all that grows there fit for food, and the wild things are dark, queer, and savage. I will provide you with skins for carrying water, and I will give you some bows and arrows, but I doubt very much whether anything you find in Mirkwood will be wholesome to eat or to drink. There is one stream there, I know, black and strong, which crosses the path. That you should neither drink of nor bathe in, for I have heard that it carries enchantment and a great drowsiness and forgetfulness. And in the dim shadows of that place I don't think you will shoot anything, wholesome or unwholesome, without straying from the path. This you must not do for any reason. That is the advice I can give to you. Beyond the edge of the forest I cannot help you much. You must depend on your luck and your courage and the food I send with you. At the gate of the forest I must ask you to send back my horse and my ponies, but I wish you all speed, and my house is open to you if ever you come back this way again. They thanked him, of course, with the many bows and sweepings of their hood, and with many at your service, O master of the wide wooden halls, but their spirits sank at his grave words, and they had all felt that the adventure was far more dangerous than they had thought, while at the time, even if they passed all the perils of the road, the dragon was waiting at the end. All that morning they were busy with preparations. Soon after midday they ate with Bjorn for the last time, and after the meal they mounted the steeds he was lending them, and bidding him many farewells they rode off through his gate at good pace. As soon as they left his high hedges the east of his fenced lands, they turned north and then bore to the northwest. By his advice they were no longer making for the main forest road to the south of the land. Had they followed his path, their path would have led them down to a stream from the mountains that joined the great river miles south of the Carrick. At that point there was a deep ford which they might have passed if they had still had their ponies, and beyond that a track led to the skirts of the wood and to the entrance of an old forest road. But Bjorn had warned them that that way was now often used by the goblins, while the forest road itself, he had heard, was overgrown and disused at the eastern end, and led to impassable marshes where the path had long been lost. Its eastern opening had also always been far to the south of the lonely mountain, but had left them still with a long and difficult northward march when they got to the other side. North of the Carrick, the edge of Mirkwood drew closer to the borders of the great river, and through here the mountains too drew down nearer, and Bjorn advised them to take this way. For at a place a few days' ride due north of the Carrick was the gate of a little-known pathway through Mirkwood that led almost straight through to the lonely mountain. The goblins, Bjorn had said, will not dare to cross the great river for 100 miles north of the Carrick, nor to come near my house. It's well protected at night. But I should ride fast, for if they make their raid soon, they will cross the river to the south and scour all the edge of the forest, so as to cut you off, and wargs run swifter than ponies. Still you're safer going north, even though you seem to be going back nearer to their strongholds, for that is where they will least expect, and they will have the longer ride to catch you. Be off now as quick as you may. That is why they were now riding in silence, galloping wherever the ground was grassy and smooth, with the mountains dark on their left, and in the distance the line of the river with its trees drawing ever closer. The sun had only just turned west when they started, until evening it lay golden on the land about them. It was difficult to think of pursuing goblins behind, and when they had put many miles between them and Bjorn's house, they began to talk and to sing again, and to forget the dark forest path that lay in front. But in the evening, when the dusk came on, the peaks of the mountains glowered against the sunset, they made a camp and set a guard, and most of them slept uneasily, with dreams in which there came the howling of hunting wolves and the cries of goblins. I need to pause here. I need water very badly. We're almost done with this chapter, and that's where we're going to end it, is with this chapter. It'll probably take maybe 3 more streams to get through The Hobbit, and at some point we will want to do other books like The Lord of the Rings. Don't really have much to say here. They're really just describing the land, and you could follow along with the map, of course. The main road, why wouldn't you take the main road? And Bjorn explains there's a swamp at the end. It's overgrown. You really can't pass that way. And he sets them on this secret path. Kind of neglects to mention that it goes right through Thranduil's domain, and of course that gets them into trouble later on. Let's see. Where was I here? Still the next morning dawned bright and fair again. There was an autumn-like mist white upon the ground, and the air was chill. But soon the sun rose red in the east, and the mist vanished, and while the shadows were still long, they were off again. So they rode now for 2 more days, and all the while they saw nothing save grass and flowers and birds and scattered trees, and occasionally small herds of red deer, browsing or sitting at noon in the shade. Sometimes Bilbo saw the horns of the hart sticking up out of their long grass, and at first he thought they were the dead branches of trees. That 3rd evening they were so eager to press on, for Bjorn had said they should reach the forest gate early on the 4th day, that they rode still forward after dusk and into the night beneath the moon. As the light faded, Bilbo thought he saw, far away to the right, or to the left, the shadowy form of a great bear prowling along in the same direction. But if he dared to mention it to Gandalf, the wizard only said, "Hush, take no notice." Next day they started before dawn, though their night had been short. As soon as it was light, they could see the forest coming as if it were to meet them, or waiting for them like a black and frowning wall before them. The land began to slope up, and it seemed to the hobbit that a silence began to dawn upon them. Birds began to sing less. There were no more deer, not even rabbits were to be seen. By the afternoon they had reached the eaves of Mirkwood, and were resting almost beneath the great overhanging boughs of its outer trees. Their trunks were huge and gnarled, their branches twisted, their leaves were dark and long. Ivy grew on them and trailed along the ground. "Well, here is Mirkwood," said Gandalf, "the greatest of the forests of the northern world. I hope you like the look of it. Now you must send back those excellent ponies you have borrowed." The dwarves were inclined to grumble at this, but the wizard told them they were fools. "Bjorn is not as far off as you seem to think, and you had better keep your promises anyway, for he is a bad enemy. Mr. Baggins's eyes are sharper than yours. If you've not seen each night after dark a great bear going along with us or sitting off in the moon watching our camps. Not only to guard you and guide you, but to keep an eye on the ponies too. Bjorn may be your friend, but he loves his animals as his children. You do not guess what kindness he has shown you in letting dwarves ride upon them so far and so fast, nor what would happen to you if you tried to take them into the forest." "What of the horse, then?" said Thorin. You don't mention sending him back." "I don't, because I'm not sending it." "What about your promise, then?" "I will look after that. I'm not sending the horse back. I'm riding it." Then they knew that Gandalf was going to leave them at the very edge of Mirkwood, and they were in despair. But nothing they could say would change his mind. "Now we've had all this out before, when we landed on the Carrack," he said. "It's no use arguing. I have, as I told you, some pressing business away south, and I'm already late, though bothering with you people. We may meet again before it is all over, and again, of course, we may not. That depends on your luck and your courage and sense, and I'm sending Mr. Baggins with you. I've told you before that he has more about him than you can guess, and you will not find that out before long. So cheer up, Bilbo, and don't look so glum. Cheer up, Thorin and company. This is your expedition, after all. Think of the treasure at the end, and forget the forest and the dragon, at any rate until tomorrow morning." When tomorrow morning came, he still said the same. So now there was nothing left to do but to fill their water skins at a clear spring they found close to the forest gate, and unpack the ponies. They distributed the packages as fairly as they could, though Bilbo thought his lot was wearisomely heavy, and he did not at all like the idea of trudging for miles and miles with all that on his back. "Don't you worry," said Thorin. "It will get lighter all too soon. Before long, I expect we shall all wish our packs heavier when the food begins to run short." Then at last they all said goodbye to their ponies and turned their heads for home. Off they trotted gaily, seemingly very glad to put their tails towards the shadow of Mirkwood. As they went away, Bilbo could have sworn that a thing like a bear left the shadow of the trees and shambled off quickly after them. Now Gandalf too said farewell. Bilbo sat on the ground feeling very unhappy and wishing he was beside the wizard on his tall horse. He had gone just inside the forest after breakfast, a very poor one. It had seemed as dark in there in the morning as at night, and very secret, a sort of watching and waiting feeling, he said to himself. "Goodbye," said Gandalf to Thorin, "and goodbye to you all. Goodbye. Straight through the forest is your way now. Don't stray off the track. If you do, it is 1,000 to 1 you will find it again, and never get out of Mirkwood, and then I don't suppose I or anyone else will ever see you again." "Do we really have to go through?" groaned the hobbit. "Yes, you do," said the wizard. "If you want to get to the other side, you must either go through or give up your quest, and I'm not going to allow you to back out now, Mr. Baggins. I'm ashamed of you for thinking of it." "You have got to look after all these dwarves for me," he laughed. "Oh, no," said Bilbo, "I didn't mean that. I meant, is there no way around?" "There is, if you got to go 200 miles or so out of your way north and twice that south. But you wouldn't get a safe path even then. There are no safe paths in this part of the world. Remember, you are over the edge of the wild now, and in for all sorts of fun wherever you go. Before you could get round Mirkwood in the north, you would be right among the slopes of the Grey Mountains, and they are simply stiff with goblins, hobgoblins, and orcs of the worst description. Before you can get round it to the south, you would get into the land of the necromancer. And even you, Bilbo, won't need me to tell you tales of that black sorcerer. I don't advise you to go anywhere near the places overlooked by his dark tower. Stick to the forest track. Keep your spirits up. Hope for the best. And with a tremendous slice of luck, you may come out one day and see the long marshes lying below you, and beyond them, high in the east, the lonely mountain, where dear old Smaug lives. Though I hope he's not expecting you." "Very comforting you are, to be sure," growled Thorin. "Goodbye. If you won't come with us, you'd better get off without any more talk." "Goodbye, then, and really goodbye," said Gandalf. And he turned his horse and rode down into the west. But he could not resist the temptation to have the last word. Before he had passed quite out of hearing, he turned, and put his hands to his mouth and called to them. They heard his voice come faintly, "Goodbye. Be good, take care of yourselves, and don't leave the path." Then he galloped away, and was soon lost to sight. "Oh, goodbye and go away," grunted the dwarves, all the more angry because they were really filled with dismay at losing him. Now began the most dangerous part of their journey. They each shouldered their heavy pack and the water skin which was their share, and turned from the light that lay in the lands outside and plunged into the forest. So that's the end of that chapter. We're going to be ending. I've gone later than I normally would, because that was a long chapter. Obviously, to comment about, Gandalf mentions that he has business to the south. And he mentions that if they travel to the south, they will be getting a little too close to the lair of the necromancer. Of course, we know now that that's Sauron. And that's where Gandalf's going. He's in the same forest. He's in Mirkwood at the same time they are. But he's with Saruman and Elrond and Círdan and Celeborn and probably Radagast as well. And they're driving the necromancer, Sauron, out of the forest. Which is a good thing when you think about Bilbo trudging along with the One Ring not very far away. It's kind of interesting to think about. Anyway, thank you guys for coming by. This was really fun. We're going to go over the schedule for the next week or so, and then we're going to end the stream as we normally do by doing a raid. So don't go anywhere just yet. Please stick around, at least through the raid. I'm going to come back over here to kind of show what we're doing. Tomorrow afternoon, we'll be playing Paper Mario, The Thousand-Year Door, on the GameCube. Saturday night, I'll be doing Xenoblade Chronicles X on the Wii U. Sunday night, more of Castlevania Curse of Darkness for the PlayStation 2. Monday afternoon, Street Fighter Alpha 3 Upper on the PlayStation. Tuesday night, Eterna Noctis. It's not showing. There it is. Eterna Noctis for Steam. Wednesday afternoon, well, hopefully to finish up Wario Land 3. Thursday night, a week from today, is going to be the List Critics podcast with me and Jesse and Elise. So another podcast next Thursday. We're going to be doing the List Critics. So let's head here. Oh, that's not the right one. I'll find it eventually. Here we go. So yeah, it was a really fun stream. My voice is very, very gone at this point. So let's find somebody to raid. It would be nice if Professor Corey Olsen was on, since he's another Tolkien scholar. But unfortunately, he is on. Hold on, he is on. We need to raid him. And he's playing The Lord of the Rings online. Let's definitely raid Corey. Absolutely. He's my inspiration. He's the reason I'm doing all this. He doesn't always acknowledge raids, but hopefully he will acknowledge it.
Oh, but I was going to say, I can think of another reason why
1 second.
Sauron stuff would be thrown down and burned right away. And that is if either the Gondorians did it or the locals did it in order to thinking they were going to prevent the Gondorians from pounding on them. To be like, oh no, Sauron, no, we're totally distancing ourselves from them. That would be, those are the two reasons I can think of. But,
since we have a bee emote and we were talking so much about bees, I'll give a little bit of the Errantry poem as our raid call. So everybody please copy that, paste it once we get into Professor Corey's stream. He's lecturing and he's playing The Lord of the Rings online. He's got a bunch of other people, and he doesn't always acknowledge raids. Hopefully he will acknowledge us. So we'll see you guys over there. We'll see you guys on the Discord. We'll see you guys tomorrow for whatever I said, Paper Mario, and just around in general. And of course, we'll be doing in 2 weeks. Actually, we'll be doing the Council of Tolkien again. So on the 4th. So that'll be exciting. Here we go.